The wind screamed through the pines with a sound like tearing fabric, and Margaret Whitmore ran. Her skirts tangled around her ankles. Her breath came in ragged gasps that burned her lungs, but she ran anyway because staying in that cabin one more second would have driven her mad. The December cold bit through her traveling coat as if the wool were paper, but fear drove her faster than any temperature could slow her. Behind her, the cabin door stood open, spilling yellow lamplight onto snow that was already beginning to drift across the threshold. Behind her, James Hartley stood in that doorway, watching her flee with the same hollow expression he'd worn watching 6 other women make this same desperate escape. 7 days. Margaret had lasted 7 days. The wagon was already turning around, Calvin Tucker shaking his head as he helped her climb onto the seat beside him. His face held no judgment, only the weary recognition of a man who had made this trip too many times. "Your trunk, ma'am?" "Leave it!" Margaret's voice was shrill, breaking on the words. "Just go. Please, just go." The wagon lurched forward. Calvin didn't argue. He'd learned not to argue with women who wore that particular expression, the one that said something inside them had cracked and wouldn't be put back together on this mountain. James stood in the doorway until the wagon disappeared around the bend where the path curved between 2 massive Douglas firs. He stood there as the snow began to fall harder, as the wind picked up and started howling through the valley with the voice of something hungry and ancient. He stood there until his shoulders were white with accumulation and his hands had gone numb. Then he went inside and closed the door. The cabin felt larger now, the way it always did after they left. The fire crackled in the stone hearth he'd built with his own hands, throwing shadows that danced across walls made of logs he'd cut and fitted himself. Everything in this space bore the mark of his labor, 3 years of solitary work transforming wilderness into something that could almost be called a home. Almost. Margaret's presence had barely left an impression. Her trunk sat in the corner of the bedroom he'd never actually shared with any of them, and somewhere in there would be the dresses she'd brought, the small luxuries she'd thought might make frontier life bearable. She'd never unpacked, not really. The trunk had remained closed except for grabbing what she needed each day, as if she'd known from the start that she wouldn't be staying. They never unpacked. James moved to the window and looked out at the darkening forest. The snow was coming down in earnest now, the kind of heavy fall that meant the pass would be impassable within a day or two. Winter was tightening its grip on the high country, and he was alone again. Alone was familiar. Alone was what he'd chosen when he'd come to this mountain 4 years ago, carrying nothing but a pack of supplies, an axe, and guilt that weighed more than both. Alone had been the plan. But 3 years of it had worn grooves into his soul, places where the silence settled and refused to move. 3 years of talking only to himself in the wind had started to make him wonder if he was still fully human, or if he'd become something else, something that belonged more to the mountain than to any town or civilization. That's when he'd contacted the marriage broker in Denver. The letter had been difficult to write. James had labored over it for weeks, trying to find words that were honest without being entirely hopeless. He'd described the cabin, the work, the isolation. He'd been clear about the winters, about the fact that the nearest town was a 3-day journey down treacherous mountain paths. He'd mentioned that supplies came only twice a year if the weather cooperated, and that a woman choosing this life would need to be strong in ways that had nothing to do with romance. The broker had written back with enthusiasm James found baffling. "Your honesty is refreshing, Mr. Hartley. Many women are seeking exactly the kind of straightforward partnership you describe. I believe I can find you an excellent match." 7 excellent matches later, James was starting to think the broker was either an optimist or a liar. Carolyn had been first. She'd arrived in April when the mountain was at its most beautiful, covered in wildflowers and humming with new life. She'd smiled at the cabin, complimented his carpentry, and made it through exactly 3 days before the reality of no neighbors, no shops, and no society had broken through her determination. She'd wept as she left, apologizing, saying she truly wanted to try. Sarah came next in June. She'd made it 5 days before a bear wandered through the clearing near the cabin. The animal had been a juvenile, more curious than dangerous, but Sarah's screams had echoed through the valley for an hour after it ambled away. She'd been gone by morning. Elizabeth lasted 4 days. Rebecca 6, Marianne 5, Patricia 4, and now Margaret. 7 days, a new record, though James took no comfort in it. He moved away from the window and began the evening routine that had become second nature over the years. Banking the fire to burn through the night, checking the door and window seals for drafts, setting out supplies for morning. The tasks were automatic, requiring no thought, which left his mind free to circle the same familiar territory it always did when he was alone. This wasn't supposed to be his life. The memories came unbidden, as they always did in the quiet hours. The logging camp down in the valley before he'd come to the mountain. The sound of saws biting into ancient timber. The shouts of men working in the coordinated chaos that kept everyone alive in a profession that killed regularly. The particular creak of a rope under too much strain. And then the sound he still heard in dreams, the crack of breaking wood followed by the shorter, wetter crack of a breaking body. Thomas Farrell had been his partner, his friend, the man who'd taught him how to read the timber and know which trees were widowmakers waiting to kill the unwary. Thomas had also been the man James had ignored when he'd pointed at a particular rope rigging and said it looked frayed. "It'll hold," James had said. "We're behind schedule." It'll hold. It hadn't. Thomas had left a wife and 2 children. James had left the logging camp the same day they'd buried him, unable to meet the eyes of Thomas's widow, unable to explain that it should have been him under that tree instead. That if he'd just listened, if he'd just taken the extra hour to replace the rope, he shook his head, forcing the memories back. This was why he'd come to the mountain, to do penance in solitude, to build something with his own hands that couldn't hurt anyone else. The cabin was his cathedral, the isolation his monastery. But 3 years of that had taught him something unexpected. Guilt was a poor companion. It didn't fill the silence or warm the cold. It just sat there, a weight that grew heavier instead of lighter. Until he'd started to wonder if maybe suffering alone wasn't actually noble, but just another form of giving up. Hence the marriage broker. Hence 7 women who'd each looked at his life and decided they'd rather face uncertainty anywhere else than certainty here. James couldn't blame them. Looking around the cabin now, seeing it through their eyes, he understood. It was well-built and weather-tight, but it was also cramped and primitive and impossibly isolated. The kind of place that could feel romantic for about an hour before reality set in. He was preparing for bed when he noticed Margaret's trunk again. Tomorrow he'd need to go through it, set aside anything valuable to return to her when the spring thaw allowed Calvin's wagon through again. The rest he'd burn or repurpose. He'd become efficient at this particular task. Sleep came hard that night, as it always did after a bride left. The cabin felt too quiet, the walls too close, his own breathing too loud in the darkness. Somewhere out in the forest, a wolf called, and others answered, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that predated human presence on this mountain by millennia. James lay awake and listened and tried not to think about the fact that he was 32 years old and getting further from human company with each passing season. Morning arrived with the crystalline brightness unique to fresh snowfall at altitude. James rose before dawn, as always, and stepped outside to find the world transformed. 2 feet of new snow had fallen during the night, smoothing every rough edge, muffling every sound. His breath plumed in air so cold it hurt to inhale. The animals needed tending first. He'd built a small barn that housed 2 goats, a dozen chickens, and his horse, a sturdy mountain-bred mare named Patience. The goats bleated their complaints about the cold as he milked them, and the chickens huddled together for warmth, barely interested in the feed he scattered. Patience stamped and snorted, clearly displeased with the weather but philosophical about it in the way of animals born to harsh climates. James spent a few minutes brushing her coat, more for his own comfort than hers. She was warm and alive and didn't judge him for his failures. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had fully risen, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. James stood for a moment, struck as he always was by the raw beauty of this place. The previous night's darkness had given way to a vista of such pristine magnificence that it almost hurt to witness. This was why he'd come here, beyond the guilt. This terrible, magnificent beauty. The mountain demanded everything from those who lived on it, but in return it offered a kind of honesty no human society could match. Nature didn't lie or pretend or put on social graces. It simply was, in all its harsh and gorgeous truth. Inside, James made coffee and fried eggs from the chickens, eating breakfast standing at the window, watching the forest come alive with morning. A fox trotted through the clearing, its red coat brilliant against the white. Further up the slope, he could see the tracks where a mountain lion had passed during the night, the big cat's paw prints unmistakable in their size and spacing. He was washing his plate when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, that particular howl it made when it came down from the high peaks. But no, this was different, mechanical. The creak of wood and jangle of harness. A wagon. James went to the door, confusion giving way to disbelief. Calvin couldn't be coming back already. The man had left only yesterday, and with the fresh snow, the pass should have been completely blocked. But there it was, rounding the bend, a heavily loaded supply wagon struggling through snow that came halfway up the wheels. Calvin was driving, his face set in the determined grimace of a man doing something inadvisable because he'd given his word. And sitting beside him, bundled in layers of wool and fur, was a woman. James stepped out onto the porch, his heart sinking. The broker must have sent another candidate immediately, perhaps not realizing Margaret had already failed. This was going to be awkward. The wagon drew closer and James got his first clear look at the newcomer. She was large, genuinely so, her substantial frame evident even through the heavy winter clothing. Dark hair escaped from beneath her wool cap, and her face, as she turned toward him, was round and windburned and utterly composed. Calvin pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down with the groan of a man whose bones were protesting the journey. "This might be the dumbest thing I've done in 40 years of driving," he announced. "Caught me just as I was getting back to town yesterday. Said she'd paid for passage up and passage up she'd get, weather be damned." The woman was already climbing down, moving with careful deliberation. When she stood on the snow, James could see she was perhaps 5.5 feet tall and probably weighed near 300 pounds. Everything about her spoke of solidity, substance, permanence. She looked directly at James with dark eyes that held neither apology nor uncertainty. "Mr. Hartley, I presume." Her voice carried a faint accent, something Eastern but not quite placeable. "I am Eleanor Morrison. I believe you have been expecting me." James found himself at a loss. He'd been expecting someone, yes, but the broker's description of full-figured had not prepared him for Eleanor's reality. Not that her size bothered him. He'd learned long ago that what a person looked like mattered far less than what they could do. But the disconnect between expectation and reality left him fumbling for words. Yes. Welcome to the mountain, Mrs. Morrison." He gestured toward the cabin, suddenly aware of how modest it must appear. "The journey wasn't too difficult, I hope?" Eleanor stepped forward, her boots finding solid purchase in the snow without hesitation. "I have endured worse, Mr. Hartley." She looked around, taking in the cabin, the barn, the towering pines, and the snow-covered peaks beyond. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested evaluation rather than judgment. Calvin was already unloading her trunk, which James noticed was considerably larger than what the previous brides had brought. "Going to have to leave this with you and head right back down," Calvin said. "Weather's turning worse, and I'm already risking my neck as is." Eleanor turned to him. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Your service is appreciated." There was something in her tone, a formality that wasn't coldness but rather a kind of dignity, as if she were conducting a business transaction rather than arriving at what was supposed to become her marital home. Calvin tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, ma'am. You're going to need it." He looked at James. "I'll be back with spring supplies, assuming we all survive the winter." The wagon turned laboriously in the narrow clearing, Calvin guiding the team with practiced skill. Within minutes, the sound of it had faded into the forest, leaving James and Eleanor standing in the snow, studying each other. "Your trunk," James said finally. "I'll bring it inside." Eleanor watched as he lifted it, heavy, packed with intention, and carried it toward the cabin. She followed, her steps steady despite the depth of the snow, and James found himself revising his assumptions with each observation. She moved like someone accustomed to hard work, her balance sure, her breathing controlled despite the altitude. Inside, the cabin's warmth enveloped them. Eleanor began unwrapping her layers methodically, revealing a dark wool dress that was practical rather than fashionable, sturdy enough for work. Beneath the winter padding, her size was even more apparent, but so was something else. The breadth of her shoulders, the strength in her arms, the capability in every movement. "You built this yourself," she said, running a hand along the smooth surface of the dining table. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Took 3 summers to get it right. It is good work." She continued her examination of the space, her fingers trailing along the stone hearth, the wooden shelves, the carefully fitted door frame. Solid, made to last. James felt an unexpected flush of pride at her assessment. "Thank you," Eleanor turned to face him fully. "Mr. Hartley, I think we should be clear with each other from the start. I did not come here expecting romance or comfort. I came because your letter was honest about hardship, and I respect honesty above almost all else. I am 28 years old. I have worked in textile mills since I was 14, and I am under no illusions about what I look like or what that means in terms of society's estimation of my value." The words were delivered without self-pity, just statement of fact. James found himself at a loss for how to respond. Eleanor continued, "I can sew, cook, preserve food, manage a household budget, and work harder than you likely expect. What I cannot do is pretend to be something I'm not, or pretend that this arrangement is anything other than what it is, a practical partnership. If that is acceptable to you, I believe we can make this situation work." James stared at her, his mind reeling. In 30 seconds, Eleanor Morrison had laid out more truth than the previous 7 brides had managed in their entire stays combined. He cleared his throat. "That's acceptable, Mrs. Morrison. Eleanor," she said, "if we are to live in close quarters, formality will become tiresome. Eleanor, then, and you can call me James." She nodded, satisfied, and returned her attention to the cabin. "Where should I put my things?" "The bedroom is through there." James pointed to the door off the main room. "I'll sleep out here until we determine how we want to arrange things." For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across Eleanor's face. "I appreciate the courtesy." She picked up her trunk. James stepped forward to help, but she had already lifted it, managing the weight with surprising ease, and carried it into the bedroom. James stood in the main room, listening to the sounds of her moving around, and realized he had absolutely no idea what to make of this woman. She was nothing like what he'd expected, nothing like the previous brides, nothing like anyone he'd encountered before. Through the open door, he could see her unpacking. Not just pulling out what she needed for tonight, but actually unpacking. Dresses were being hung on the pegs he'd installed. Undergarments were being placed in the small dresser. Books, several of them, were being arranged on the shelf beside the bed. She was unpacking everything. The realization hit James with unexpected force. Eleanor Morrison was planning to stay. That evening, James prepared dinner while Eleanor continued organizing the bedroom. He'd shot a rabbit 2 days ago, and he made a stew with the meat, adding potatoes and carrots from his root cellar, herbs he'd dried the previous summer. Cooking was a skill he'd taught himself through necessity, and while his meals were plain, they were substantial and edible. When he called that food was ready, Eleanor emerged from the bedroom and came to the table without hesitation. She looked around at the simple setup, 2 bowls, 2 spoons, bread he'd baked that morning, and sat down with a slight nod of approval. They ate in silence at first, the quiet broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind outside beginning to pick up again. James found himself acutely aware of her presence across from him, the way she ate with focused efficiency, the way her eyes kept moving around the cabin as if cataloging every detail. "The bread is very good," Eleanor said finally. "You baked it yourself?" "Had to learn." James felt his face warm slightly. "Not much choice up here. You learn to do everything yourself or you do without." "I can bake." Eleanor's tone was matter of fact. "And preserve food, mend clothes, manage livestock if needed." "I assume you have animals?" 2 goats, chickens, and a horse." "Good. I grew up on a farm before my family moved to the city." "The work is familiar." James studied her across the table, this woman who seemed determined to prove herself before he'd even asked. "What made you leave the mills?" Eleanor set down her spoon and met his eyes directly. "The mill closed 3 months ago. New machinery made most of us obsolete. I had some savings, but not enough to last forever, and the prospects for a woman my age and appearance in the city are limited. Marriage, even to a stranger in a remote location, seemed preferable to slow starvation or the kind of work that destroys what's left of your soul. The honesty was brutal and refreshing. And you chose my advertisement specifically? I read 43 advertisements, Mr. Hartley. Most of them promised ease and comfort and gentle living. Yours was the only one that mentioned hardship and isolation and the need for genuine capability. She picked up her spoon again. I have learned to distrust promises of ease. Difficulty, at least, is honest. James felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of kinship he hadn't expected. He'd chosen this mountain for similar reasons, fleeing false comfort for honest struggle. You should know, he said slowly, that 7 women came before you. None of them lasted more than a week. Eleanor didn't seem surprised. What frightened them away? Different things. The isolation, the cold, the work, the fact that life up here is exactly as hard as I described and not one bit easier. And you wonder if I'll be the 8th failure. James couldn't deny it. Eleanor pushed her empty bowl aside and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hartley, James, I spent 14 years working 16-hour days in conditions that destroyed the health of everyone around me. I watched people lose fingers to machines, die of lung disease from the cotton dust, work themselves to death for wages that barely kept them alive. I have lived in boarding houses where 12 women shared a single room, where the water was often contaminated, where winter meant choosing between heat and food. She paused, letting the words settle. This cabin is warm and weather-tight. The work is hard but honest. The isolation is profound but peaceful. I see no reason to run from it. James found himself without response. Everything she said was true, and yet it reframed his entire understanding of what he had to offer. To him, this life was penance, a hard existence chosen as punishment for his failures. But to someone like Eleanor, someone who had survived genuine industrial brutality, it might look like something else entirely. Opportunity. They finished dinner in more comfortable silence. Eleanor helped clean up, moving around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime making herself useful in cramped quarters. She noticed where things were kept, adapted to his systems without being asked, and contributed without needing direction. When the dishes were done, she returned to the bedroom, and James heard the sound of her continuing to unpack. He sat by the fire, ostensibly repairing a leather harness, but mostly just watching the flames and trying to understand what had just happened. Eleanor Morrison was nothing like the others, but whether that meant she would stay or whether it simply meant she'd leave for different reasons, he couldn't yet tell. The wind picked up outside and James rose to check the door and window seals, a nightly ritual that would become more important as winter deepened. When he passed the bedroom door, he glimpsed Eleanor sitting on the bed, holding a small wooden frame with what appeared to be a photograph inside. Her expression, normally so composed, had softened into something that looked like grief. James didn't interrupt. Whatever memory she was holding, it belonged to her alone. He settled into his bedroll by the fire, listening to the wind and the creaking of the cabin and the small sounds of Eleanor moving about in the next room. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel quite so oppressive. Maybe it was foolish to hope. Probably it was. But as sleep finally claimed him, James found himself thinking that perhaps Eleanor Morrison understood something the others hadn't. That beautiful things are allowed to be difficult. The wind howled through the night, piling snow against the northern wall of the cabin in drifts that would take hours to clear. James woke once in the darkness to the sound of a tree branch breaking under the weight of ice, the crack like a rifle shot in the frozen air. He lay in his bedroll, staring at the dying embers of the fire, and wondered what morning would bring. In the bedroom, Eleanor lay awake as well, her hand resting on the photograph she tucked beneath her pillow. The face in the frame was young, hopeful, full of a belief that everything would work out if you just tried hard enough. Thomas had been wrong about that. Everything hadn't worked out. But that was a truth for another day, another conversation. For now, Eleanor focused on the warmth of the cabin, the solidity of the walls, the quiet strength she'd seen in James Hartley's eyes when he looked at her without flinching. She'd survived worse than a hard winter in a stranger's household. She'd survived this too, And maybe, if she was fortunate, she'd do more than survive. Maybe she'd find something worth keeping. Word count check. 3,147 plus 1,045 equals 4,192 words so far. Continuing to target 5,500, 6,000. Morning arrived with the kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals before it left your lungs. James woke to find the fire reduced to ash and the cabin interior cold enough that frost had formed on the inside of the windows. He rose quickly, his joints protesting, and set about rebuilding the fire with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was routine. The kindling caught, flames licking upward, and slowly warmth began to spread through the room. James was adding larger logs when Eleanor emerged from the bedroom, already fully dressed, her hair pinned back with the same no-nonsense efficiency she brought to everything else. "Good morning," she said, her voice betraying no complaint about the temperature, despite the white puffs of her breath. "Morning," James gestured toward the fire. "Coffee will be ready soon." Eleanor moved past him to the window, looking out at the world of white beyond. How deep is the snow now? 2 feet, maybe more where it's drifted. James joined her at the window. "The pass will be completely closed by tonight if this keeps up. So we're truly isolated now, until spring thaw, usually mid-April if we're lucky." Eleanor nodded, absorbing this information without visible reaction. "Then we should take inventory of supplies and plan accordingly." Her practicality continued to surprise him. Most of the previous brides had responded to news of their isolation with panic or tears or demands to know why he hadn't warned them, despite the fact that he had extensively in his letters. James made coffee while Eleanor examined the food stores with the critical eye of someone who'd managed resources before. She pulled items from shelves, checked preservation dates on canned goods, assessed quantities with quick mental calculations. "You have adequate flour," she announced. "Salt is good, sufficient dried beans and rice." She frowned at a container of sugar. "This is low, but we can manage if we're careful." "We?" The word slipped out before James could stop it. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I assume we're planning to eat together for the next 4 months?" "Yes, but I meant—" James stopped, realizing he wasn't sure what he meant. "You're waiting for me to leave," Eleanor said. It wasn't accusatory, just observant, like the others did. James couldn't deny it. Eleanor set down the sugar container and turned to face him fully. "Mr. Hartley, James, I understand your skepticism. 7 failures would make anyone cautious. But I am not those women. I knew exactly what I was agreeing to when I answered your advertisement. I have no romantic illusions about frontier life. I have no expectation of ease or comfort. What I have is a very clear understanding that this situation, difficult as it may be, is still better than what I left behind." She moved closer, and James was struck again by the solidity of her presence, the way she occupied space without apology. "I am here because I choose to be," Eleanor continued. "Not because I had nowhere else to go, though that's partly true, but because I read your letter and thought, here is a man who won't lie to me about what life costs. That matters more to me than you can possibly understand." James found himself believing her, or at least wanting to believe her. But belief was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. He'd learned that lesson 7 times already. "Then let's plan for winter," he said, keeping his voice neutral, "and see where we are come spring." Eleanor's expression suggested she understood exactly what he wasn't saying. Fair enough. They spent the morning organizing supplies, with Eleanor bringing a level of systematic thinking James had never bothered with. She suggested rearranging the storage to put most used items within easier reach, noted which goods should be consumed first to prevent spoilage, and identified several places where better organization would reduce waste. James found himself deferring to her judgment more often than not. She approached household management the way he approached carpentry, with careful attention to detail and an understanding that small efficiencies compounded over time. By midday, the cabin was reorganized, and Eleanor had produced a detailed meal plan that would stretch their supplies comfortably through April. James looked at her careful handwriting, the neat columns of numbers, and felt a flicker of something that might have been relief. "You're good at this," he said. Eleanor shrugged. "When you've spent 14 years making pennies stretch to cover food and rent, you learn to be good at it. Over a simple lunch of bread and cheese, Eleanor asked about his daily routines. James explained the rhythm of mountain life: morning chores with the animals, checking trap lines 3 times a week, chopping firewood, maintaining the cabin and equipment, hunting when supplies ran low. "I can help with the animals," Eleanor offered, "and the firewood within reason. The trap lines are beyond me, I assume?" James nodded. "The terrain is too dangerous if you don't know it intimately. But there's plenty else that needs doing: cooking, mending, managing the indoor supplies." His gaze drifted to a basket in the corner, overflowing with clothes in need of repair. "I've been letting that pile up for months." Eleanor followed his look, and something like satisfaction crossed her face. "I can have that done within a week." That afternoon, while James went out to clear snow from the barn and tend to the animals, Eleanor set up a work area near the window where the light was best. When he returned, she was already deep into the mending, her needle flying through fabric with the speed and precision of professional work. James stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before announcing his presence. She'd transformed the space subtly, moving the chair to catch better light, organizing thread by color, creating a system that spoke of years of similar work. This was her domain, he realized. The way the forest was his. The way carpentry was his. Everyone had their expertise, the skills that made them valuable. Eleanor looked up, caught him watching. "Is something wrong?" "No," James said. "Just impressed." She returned to her work with a small smile, and James moved to his own tasks, feeling for the first time that maybe the cabin wasn't quite as empty as it had been. The day passed in quiet productivity, each of them occupied with separate work, but somehow more comfortable in the shared space than they'd been the night before. Eleanor hummed softly as she sewed, an almost unconscious sound that filled the silence without demanding attention. James found it pleasant. The previous brides had either filled every moment with nervous chatter or sat in resentful silence. Eleanor's contented humming was something else entirely, the sound of someone at peace with their work and their surroundings. Evening came early at this time of year, darkness falling by 5 o'clock. James lit lamps while Eleanor prepared dinner, having insisted she take over cooking duties since she was, as she put it, already accustomed to it and frankly better at it. She wasn't wrong. The stew she produced was noticeably more flavorful than James's attempts, seasoned with herbs he'd grown but never quite known how to use properly. "This is excellent," he told her. Eleanor accepted the compliment with a nod. "My mother taught me to cook before she died. It's one of the few good things I have from her." James heard the weight behind those words but didn't push. If Eleanor wanted to share more, she would in her own time. They ate in companionable silence, and afterward Eleanor produced a book from her trunk, a worn copy of something James didn't recognize, and settled by the fire to read. James worked on the leather harness again, the one he'd been pretending to repair for days now. The wind picked up outside and snow began to fall again, visible in the lamplight through the window. The cabin creaked and settled, familiar sounds that James had learned to distinguish from anything that might signal actual danger. "Do you ever get lonely?" Eleanor asked suddenly, not looking up from her book. The question caught James off guard. "Every day." Eleanor nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "In the city, I was surrounded by people constantly. Boarding house, factory floor, streets, hundreds of people every day. And I was the loneliest I've ever been." James understood that paradox better than he would have expected. Being around people who don't see you is worse than being alone. Exactly. Eleanor closed her book and looked at him directly. "Up here, at least the loneliness is honest." James set aside the harness he wasn't really fixing. "That's why I came to the mountain. After, after something happened. I needed a place where I couldn't pretend anymore." Eleanor waited, giving him space to continue or not as he chose. "I worked in a logging camp," James said. "My partner died because I made a bad call. Told him to keep working when he said equipment was unsafe. He was right. I was wrong. He died, and He stopped, the familiar weight settling on his chest. I couldn't stay there. Couldn't face his widow, his children. So I came up here. To punish yourself." It wasn't a question. James met Eleanor's eyes and saw understanding there, not judgment. "Maybe," he admitted, Or maybe just to be somewhere the consequences of my mistakes couldn't hurt anyone else. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. My first husband killed himself, she said finally, her voice steady but soft. Walked into a river in January and didn't come back out. We'd been married 6 months. James felt the breath leave his lungs. Eleanor, she held up a hand. I tell you this not for sympathy, but so you understand that I know something about carrying guilt. Thomas died because he couldn't handle our poverty, our prospects, the weight of trying and failing. And for years I wondered if I'd been prettier, more capable, somehow better. Maybe he would have found something worth living for. But you don't believe that anymore, James asked gently. I believe Thomas made his choice, and I made mine. He chose to surrender. I chose to survive. Eleanor's eyes met his again. We can't save people from themselves, James. We can only decide how we'll respond to the damage they leave behind. The words hit James with unexpected force. He'd spent 4 years on this mountain trying to atone for Thomas Farrell's death. But maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe what happened wasn't something he could fix through suffering. Maybe it was just something he had to learn to carry. They sat in silence after that, but it was different from the silence of previous nights. This was the silence of two people who'd shown each other their scars and found recognition rather than disgust. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside the cabin, something fragile and new was beginning to take root. When Eleanor finally stood to retire for the night, she paused at the bedroom door. Thank you for telling me about your partner. Thank you for telling me about your husband. She nodded once, then disappeared into the bedroom, leaving James alone with the fire and his thoughts. For the first time in 4 years, those thoughts felt a little less heavy. James banked the fire and prepared his bedroll, but before settling in, he moved to the window and looked out at the darkness. Somewhere out there was the forest he knew intimately, the mountains that had become his refuge, the wilderness that had replaced human connection. But inside this cabin was another human being who understood loss and guilt and the choice to keep going despite both. It wasn't love. It might never be love, but it was something. And after 7 failures, something felt like enough. The second week brought routine, and with it, the first real test of whether Eleanor Morrison would prove different from her predecessors. James woke each morning to find her already moving about the cabin, fire rebuilt, coffee brewing, her efficiency suggesting this was not performance but ingrained habit. She learned quickly. Within 3 days, she could bank the fire properly for overnight burning, adjusting dampers with the precision that meant the difference between waking to warmth or freezing darkness. She memorized where supplies lived, adapted to his organizational systems while subtly improving them, and asked questions that showed she was thinking ahead rather than just reacting to immediate needs. How often do the goats need fresh bedding? Every 4 days in winter, less frequently when they can graze outside. Eleanor nodded, filing the information away. And the chickens stop laying when? Temperature dependent. Usually by late January, they're done until spring. She absorbed everything with the focus of someone compiling a manual for survival. James found himself explaining things he'd learned through trial and error. Which wood burned hottest, how to read the sky for weather changes 24 hours out, why you never left wet clothing to freeze because thawing it properly was nearly impossible. Eleanor listened, repeated information back to confirm understanding, and then applied it immediately. When James mentioned that pine burned fast but hot while oak burned slow and steady, she reorganized the wood pile accordingly, separating species for different purposes. The cabin began to show her influence in small ways. Herbs hung from rafters in better order. The dish towels appeared cleaner somehow. She'd found his spare blankets and aired them properly, something he'd never bothered with. Details he'd stopped noticing during his years alone suddenly mattered again because someone else was noticing them. On the 5th day, James returned from checking his nearest trap line to find Eleanor standing on a chair, reaching for the highest shelf in the pantry. She'd stripped it bare and was wiping down wood that probably hadn't been cleaned in 3 years. He paused in the doorway, watching her work. There was no self-consciousness in her movements, no awareness of being observed. She was simply doing what needed doing, the way she approached everything else. You don't have to do that, he said. Eleanor glanced down at him without pausing in her work. I'm aware, but I prefer things properly maintained. Her tone carried no judgment, just statement of preference. James hung up his coat. Boots shedding snow onto the floor. He now noticed Eleanor swept daily. The previous brides had either ignored housekeeping entirely or performed it with visible resentment. Eleanor seemed to view it as neither burden nor virtue, just necessary work that prevented larger problems later. That evening she presented him with his mended clothes, not just the basket he'd shown her, but items she'd found in his trunk that he'd forgotten existed. A shirt he'd torn 2 years ago, now repaired with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Trousers with patches that actually matched the fabric. Even his winter coat had been reinforced at stress points he hadn't realized were weakening. This is remarkable work, James told her, examining a repair that looked stronger than the original seam. Eleanor shrugged. 14 years in textile mills teaches you to sew or you don't eat. Speed and quality both matter when you're paid by the piece. She'd mentioned the mills before, but always in fragments. James found himself curious about the life she'd left behind, though he wasn't sure how to ask without seeming intrusive. Eleanor solved the problem for him by volunteering information as they worked side by side preparing dinner. Her knife moved through potatoes with the rhythm of long practice as she talked. My parents died when I was 14. Factory fire in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She said it without emotion. Just fact. 73 people died. My mother and father were two of them. I had 3 younger siblings to support, twin brothers who were 12, and a sister who was 9. Christ, James breathed. The mill owners paid for funerals, but nothing else. Company housing, company store, all of it became debts we owed. So I went to work in a different mill, lied about my age, and started paying down what they claimed we owed while keeping my siblings alive. She moved to the next potato, her hand steady. The twins are 26 now, working in Boston. My sister married a shop clerk in Providence. They're all safe, settled, don't need me anymore. That's when I realized I could finally make a choice for myself. And you chose this, James said, gesturing around the cabin. I chose honest hardship over dishonest ease. Eleanor looked at him directly. In the city, people pretend poverty is a moral failing. They work you to death and tell you it's your fault you're poor. Up here, at least the mountain doesn't lie about what it costs to survive. James understood that distinction more than he could articulate. The mountain demanded everything, but it never pretended otherwise. They ate dinner while wind began to pick up outside, a low moan that James recognized as the leading edge of something larger. He'd been watching the sky all day, noting the particular quality of light that preceded major weather systems. Storm coming, he said. Big one. Eleanor looked toward the window where darkness had fallen completely. How big? 3 days at least. Maybe more. The kind that traps you inside until it passes. Something flickered across Eleanor's face. Not fear exactly, but a brief tightening around her eyes that had suggested she was calculating what 3 days of forced proximity might mean. We have adequate supplies? She asked. More than adequate. Then we'll manage. That night, James lay in his bedroll listening to the wind build from moan to howl. The cabin creaked around him, timbers shifting under pressure, and he mentally reviewed every seal and joint, every potential weak point that might fail under sustained assault. In the bedroom, Eleanor lay awake as well, her hand resting on the photograph beneath her pillow. She'd been in this cabin 8 days now, longer than 5 of James's previous brides, but still short of Margaret's week-long record. The thought brought an unexpected flash of competitive irritation. She wasn't leaving. She'd come here with clear eyes and firm intention, and some spoiled city woman's inability to cope had nothing to do with Eleanor's own capacity for endurance. She would outlast them all. The storm hit just before dawn. James woke to the sound of wind so violent it seemed to shake the cabin's foundation. Snow drove against the walls with the force of thrown sand, and the temperature had plummeted to levels that made breathing painful even inside. He rebuilt the fire quickly, feeding it until flames roared up the chimney, and was still kneeling before the hearth when Eleanor emerged from the bedroom. Already dressed, her expression alert but calm. It's bad, she said, not a question. As bad as it gets up here. James stood, brushing ash from his hands. We're locked in until it passes. No going outside except absolutely necessary. The animals? Secured yesterday. They'll be fine in the barn for a few days. Eleanor moved to the window, though there was nothing to see except white chaos. The glass rattled in its frame, and she reached out to test the seal, her fingers finding the draft he knew was there, but had never bothered to fix properly. "This needs attention," she said. James nodded. "I've been meaning to. Let's do it now, before it gets worse." They worked together, Eleanor holding strips of cloth while James packed them into gaps around the window frame. Her hands were smaller, more nimble in tight spaces, and several times she reached places his thicker fingers couldn't access. Their shoulders brushed as they worked in close proximity. James was aware of her warmth, the faint scent of the soap she used, the quiet competence of her movements. None of the previous brides had been comfortable with casual physical proximity. Eleanor seemed unbothered by necessity. By mid-morning, the storm had intensified to the point where the cabin felt like an island in a sea of white violence. Visibility outside was zero. The wind screamed around corners and found every tiny gap in the structure, making the whole building groan like a living thing in pain. Eleanor had settled by the fire with more mending, apparently content to work in silence. James attempted to read but found his attention drifting to her instead, watching the play of firelight across her concentrated face. "Tell me about the logging," she said suddenly, not looking up from her work. "What happened to your partner?" The question caught James unprepared. He'd mentioned Thomas Farrell days ago in that late-night moment of shared confession, but he'd assumed Eleanor would let it rest there. Instead, she was offering him the same thing she'd given, full truth, not comfortable half-stories. James set down his book. "We were rigging a widowmaker. That's what we called the really big trees, the ones that could kill you if anything went wrong. Thomas noticed a rope looked frayed, said we should replace it before we started the pull. And you didn't," Eleanor said quietly. "We were behind quota. Management was threatening layoffs. I told Thomas it would hold, that we couldn't afford the delay." His voice roughened. "I was wrong. The rope snapped during the pull. The tree fell wrong. Thomas was—" He stopped, the memory vivid even 4 years later. He died instantly, left a wife and 2 children. And I left the camp the same day because I couldn't look at them knowing it should have been me. Eleanor's hands had stilled on her mending. "You blame yourself." "Of course I blame myself. It was my fault." She looked at him then, her dark eyes steady. Was Thomas capable of making his own decisions? Was he an adult man with free will? James felt his jaw tighten. "That's not the point. It's exactly the point." Eleanor set aside her sewing. "You made a bad call." Thomas chose to follow it despite his own doubts. He could have refused, could have insisted on replacing the rope regardless of what you said, but he didn't because he made his own choice to prioritize quota over safety. "That doesn't absolve me," James said. "No, but it means you're not solely responsible for his death." Eleanor's tone was firm without being harsh. "You carry guilt, James. I understand that intimately. But guilt and responsibility aren't the same thing. Thomas's widow lost her husband because both of you made poor choices under pressure, not because you're uniquely evil or incompetent." The words hit like physical blows. Not because they were cruel, but because they suggested a possibility James had never allowed himself to consider, that maybe his guilt was disproportionate to his actual culpability. "I ran away," he said, "from the consequences, from his family, from everything. You made distance between yourself and a situation where you couldn't help. That's not cowardice. That's survival." Eleanor picked up her mending again, giving him space to process. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something in James's chest felt fractionally lighter. That night, they shared dinner by firelight while the wind howled like something hungry outside. The conversation had shifted to safer topics. Eleanor's favorite books, James's plans for expanding the garden come spring, but the earlier exchange had created a new intimacy between them. James found himself watching her in unguarded moments, noticing things he'd overlooked initially. The way her face softened when she talked about her siblings, the competence in her hands as she worked, the quiet strength in her posture, even after hours of sitting. She wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. Her size, her age, her weathered hands, none of it fit society's narrow definition of feminine worth. But there was something compelling about her self-possession. the way she occupied space without apology. The second day of the storm was worse. Wind speeds increased to levels that made the cabin shake continuously. Snow piled against the north wall in drifts that reached halfway up the window. The temperature outside dropped so low that James's thermometer registered its lowest possible reading and then stopped functioning entirely. Inside, cabin fever began to set in. The space that had seemed adequate suddenly felt constraining. Eleanor's presence, comfortable yesterday, now seemed to magnify every small sound, every movement, every breath. James found himself hyper-aware of her in ways that were both pleasant and uncomfortable. The soft humming that had seemed charming now grated on nerves stretched thin by confinement. Her efficient movements around the cabin began to feel like an implicit criticism of his own sloppier habits. But if Eleanor felt similar tension, she gave no sign. She continued her routines with the same steady competence, neither demanding entertainment nor showing the restless anxiety that had driven previous brides to distraction. By evening of the second day, James's nerves were frayed enough that he made a mistake he should have caught earlier. He was refilling the water bucket from their indoor supply when he noticed a sound he'd been hearing for hours but had dismissed as wind. A draft, steady and focused, not the random whistles of normal air movement. He turned, scanning the cabin, and finally located the source. The north wall, where two logs met near the corner. There was a gap, not large but growing as the wind pressure drove snow through the opening and the moisture caused further expansion. "We have a problem," he said. Eleanor set down her book immediately and followed him to the corner. She knelt, examining the gap with her fingers, snow already beginning to pile on the floor beneath it. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. If this keeps up, the whole seal could fail. We'd lose most of our heat. What do we need to fix it?" James was already moving, pulling supplies from storage. "We need to pack it with something that will expand when wet, seal it from inside and out." Eleanor's face showed no panic, just focused attention. "What can I do?" They worked together for the next hour, Eleanor's smaller hands proving essential for working the makeshift chinking into the narrow gap. James held materials while she packed them in with precise, determined movements. Her fingers quickly became raw from the rough wood and cold, but she didn't stop or complain. At one point, she had to lean across him to reach the highest part of the gap, and James felt the solid weight of her against his shoulder, smelled the faint scent of the soap she'd used that morning. It was oddly intimate, this forced proximity in the midst of crisis. "There," Eleanor said finally, stepping back to examine their work. "That should hold until the storm passes." She was right. The draft had stopped, the gap sealed with their improvised solution. "Thank you," James said, and meant it more than she could know. "I've been managing alone so long, I sometimes forget two people can solve problems better than one." Eleanor looked at him with those appraising dark eyes. "Is that why you wanted a wife, to have help with problems?" The question was more pointed than her tone suggested. James found himself struggling for honesty. "Part of it," he admitted, "but not the biggest part." What was the biggest part? James set down the tools he'd been holding, aware this was another threshold moment, another choice between comfortable distance and uncomfortable truth. "The quiet," he said finally. "It gets so quiet up here that sometimes you forget what your own voice sounds like. Sometimes you start to wonder if you're still real or if you've just become part of the mountain, another thing that exists without purpose or connection." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding evident in her expression. In the city, there was always noise, machines, crowds, people shouting, but it was the wrong kind of noise. It made you feel invisible, even when you were surrounded by hundreds of people. She looked around the cabin, listening to the storm outside. "This quiet is different. It has room in it." "Room for what?" James asked. "For thoughts. For two people finding their own rhythm." Eleanor met his eyes directly. "For building something that doesn't require constant noise to prove it exists." The words settled between them like a promise or a question or perhaps both. That night, James lay awake long after banking the fire, listening to the storm and thinking about Eleanor's words. Room for two people. He'd spent 4 years believing he needed to be alone. That isolation was both punishment and protection. But Eleanor wasn't someone who needed protecting from him. She understood failure and guilt and the weight of responsibility for others' suffering. She'd survive worse than anything he could inflict through mere proximity. Maybe the mountain had room for two after all. The storm finally broke on the third morning, leaving behind a transformed world. James and Eleanor emerged from the cabin to find snowdrifts that reached the windows in places, and a landscape so pristine and beautiful it seemed artificial. The sun blazed from a sky so intensely blue it hurt to look at directly, and every surface glittered with ice crystals that refracted light into rainbow sparks. My God, Eleanor breathed, her words creating puffs of vapor in air so cold it burned exposed skin. I've never seen anything so beautiful. James looked at her instead of the landscape, seeing the wonder in her expression, the way morning light caught her dark hair and turned it almost auburn. She'd been in his cabin 10 days now, longer than any of the others, and unlike them, she showed no signs of wanting to leave. Neither have I, he said quietly. Eleanor glanced at him, caught something in his tone, and smiled slightly before turning her attention back to the view. They spent the morning digging out paths to the barn, clearing the cabin entrance, breaking ice from water sources. Eleanor worked alongside him without complaint, her breath coming hard in the thin air, but her movement steady and determined. By afternoon, they'd restored basic functionality and were drinking coffee on the porch, watching shadows lengthen across pristine snow, when James heard it. Hoofbeats. He stood quickly, hand automatically moving toward where he kept his rifle just inside the door. Visitors were rare enough in summer, nearly unheard of in deep winter. Calvin Tucker appeared around the bend, his wagon struggling through snow that came halfway up the wheels. But he wasn't alone. A rider accompanied him, a man on a dark horse, both of them looking nearly frozen despite heavy winter gear. Calvin pulled up with visible relief. Hartley, he called. Got a male rider here who insisted on making the winter run before passes closed completely. Told him he was crazy, but he paid triple rate. The rider dismounted stiffly, pulling a leather satchel from his saddle. Official business for Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, he announced, his voice rough from cold. Letter from Lowell Savings and Trust, Massachusetts. Eleanor had gone completely still beside James. Her face, so composed moments before, had lost all color. The rider pulled out an envelope, checked the name, and handed it to Eleanor. She took it with hands that trembled slightly, the only sign of distress James had seen from her since her arrival. Calvin was already turning his wagon. Can't stay, he announced. Weather's turning again and I need to make the valley before nightfall. He looked at Eleanor. Good luck to you, ma'am. The wagon and rider disappeared back down the path, leaving James and Eleanor standing in the snow, the envelope clutched in her hand like something venomous. Eleanor? James asked carefully. She looked down at the letter, then up at him, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Fear. I need to read this inside, she said quietly. They returned to the cabin's warmth, but the cold seemed to have followed them. Eleanor sat at the table staring at the envelope for a long moment before finally breaking the seal. James watched her face as she read, saw the color drain further, saw her jaw tighten with each line. When she finished, she set the letter down with careful precision, her hands shaking now in earnest. Eleanor, what is it? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the letter as if it might change if she looked at it long enough. My parents' debt, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been paying it for 14 years. Thought I'd finally settled it last spring. But apparently there was an administrative error, or her voice hardened. More likely, they're inventing reasons to claim more money. How much? $340. She looked up at him, and the fear in her eyes had transmuted to something harder. They say if I don't pay by spring, they'll pursue legal action. Debt servitude. James felt his stomach drop. Debt servitude was legal in some eastern states, a system that allowed creditors to essentially enslave debtors until obligations were met. That's insane, he said. You've already paid. It doesn't matter what I've paid. Eleanor's voice was flat now, effect leaking away into numbness. They have ledgers that show what they say I owe. My word against the bank's records. You can imagine how that plays out in court. She stood abruptly, moving to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. I thought I was free. Thought by coming here I'd finally escaped everything that happened after my parents died. But apparently the past isn't done with me yet. James wanted to offer comfort, solutions, Something. But $340 was a staggering sum, more than he made in a year of trapping and timber work. The kind of money that might as well be $3,000 for all his ability to access it. Eleanor turned back to face him, and he saw her spine straighten, saw the fear recede behind walls of practiced control. "I'm sorry," she said. "This isn't your problem. I'll figure something out." "The hell, it's not my problem," James heard himself say. "You're my wife." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "On paper," she said carefully, "in practical arrangement, this debt preceded our marriage. It's not your responsibility." But it was, James realized, because despite everything, the short time they'd known each other, the practical nature of their arrangement, his determination not to invest hope in something that could fail, Eleanor Morrison had become someone who mattered to him. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. "Then we'd better start planning," she said quietly, "because they'll send someone to collect come spring." That night, after Eleanor had retreated to the bedroom, James sat by the fire and stared at the letter she'd left on the table. $340, an impossible sum, but not, perhaps, entirely impossible. He began making calculations in his head. His winter furs would bring maybe 180 if prices held. There was dangerous timber work available that paid premium rates. Grisly bounties, though that was essentially suicide unless you knew exactly what you were doing. James was still calculating when he heard the sound outside. At first, he thought it was wind, a branch scraping against the cabin wall. But no, this was different, deliberate, rhythmic. Footsteps. He moved to the window silently, peering out into moonlit snow. Nothing visible, but the sound continued, circling the cabin. Someone was out there. James grabbed his rifle, moved to the door, and eased it open a crack. The cold hit him immediately, but he ignored it, scanning the tree line. There, tracks in the snow, leading from the forest to within 20 feet of the cabin, then circling around back. Not animal tracks. Human. Boot prints, clear in the moonlight. Someone had been watching them. James's blood went cold. They were 3 days hard travel from the nearest homestead, a week from anything resembling a town. No one came to this altitude in winter without specific purpose. He closed the door quietly, barred it, and checked the windows. All secure, but his mind was racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. Outlaws sometimes wintered in the high country, using abandoned mining camps and hunting cabins. They were rare, but when they appeared, they were desperate and dangerous. If someone was scouting his cabin, it meant they were considering whether he had anything worth taking, or whether Eleanor was worth taking. James spent the rest of the night awake, rifle across his knees, watching the windows and listening for sounds that didn't belong. He didn't wake Eleanor. No point in terrifying her until he knew more. But when morning came and he went outside to investigate, the tracks were still there, joined by others. At least 3 different men, maybe 4, had circled his property during the night. They'd stood at the woodpile examining his supplies. They'd looked through the barn window at his animals. They'd studied the cabin itself, looking for weaknesses. And then they'd retreated back into the forest toward the old mining camp James had assumed was abandoned. He was wrong. Someone was living up there, and now they knew he wasn't alone. James followed the tracks as far as he dared, confirming his suspicions. The old camp was occupied. He could see smoke from a distance, hear the faint sounds of voices carrying on the morning air. He returned to the cabin to find Eleanor making breakfast, her face still showing the strain of yesterday's letter, but her movements steady. "We need to talk," James said. Eleanor looked up, caught something in his tone, and set down the skillet immediately. "What happened?" James told her everything. The tracks, the circling, the occupied mining camp. He watched her face pale again, but she didn't panic. "How many?" she asked. "At least 3, maybe more. Armed? Have to assume so." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing. Then her expression hardened into something James recognized, the same determination she'd shown when facing the creditor's letter, when working in brutal cold to seal the wall gap, when describing 14 years of factory work. "Then we need to prepare," she said simply. "What do I need to know?" James felt something shift in his chest. This woman who'd been in his life less than 2 weeks was already standing beside him, ready to face whatever came. For the first time since that terrible day in the logging camp, James Hartley didn't feel alone. He just hoped it wouldn't get Eleanor killed. James spent the morning teaching Eleanor to load and fire his rifle. They worked behind the cabin where the barn would provide cover if anyone approached, the cold biting through their layers as he demonstrated the mechanics. Hold it firm against your shoulder. The recoil will hurt less if you don't fight it. Eleanor took the weapon, her hand surprisingly steady. She'd admitted she'd never fired a gun, but her 14 years of factory work had taught her machine operation, and a rifle was just another tool with specific requirements. The first shot went wide, Eleanor flinching slightly at the sound. The second hit closer to the target James had marked on a tree trunk. By the 10th, she was grouping shots within a handspan at 30 yards. "You're a natural," James said, and meant it. The steadiness required for precision shooting was something most people took months to develop. Eleanor had it immediately. It's just focus and repetition. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but he saw satisfaction in her eyes, like running a sewing machine. You learn the rhythm and trust your hands to follow. They practiced until Eleanor could hit targets consistently at ranges James deemed necessary for defense. Not sport shooting, not hunting, pure survival marksmanship. The kind that might mean the difference between living and dying if the men from the mining camp decided his cabin was worth raiding. Inside, warming by the fire afterward, Eleanor cleaned the rifle with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. James watched her hands move over metal and wood, stripping, wiping, reassembling. "Tell me about them," she said. "The men at the camp." James had been expecting this question. "I'm going to scout closer tomorrow. Get a better count, see if I recognize anyone. You think they're dangerous. Men don't winter in abandoned mining camps if they have better options." His jaw tightened. "And they don't circle a homestead at night unless they're calculating whether it's worth the risk to attack." Eleanor set down the rifle, now properly cleaned and oiled. "Then we should be calculating the same thing. Our defenses, our advantage, what we do if they came." The pragmatism in her voice steadied something in James. No hysterics, no demands that he somehow make the danger disappear. Just acceptance of reality and immediate movement toward preparation. They spent the afternoon reinforcing the cabin. James showed Eleanor how to bar the door from inside with the heavy beam he'd installed years ago. They moved supplies away from windows, creating clear sight lines for defense. He positioned his second rifle where Eleanor could reach it quickly, along with ammunition and his skinning knife that was sharp enough to shave with. "If they come during the day, while I'm on the trap lines," James said, "you get inside, bar the door, and fire warning shots. Don't try to fight them directly. Just hold them off until I get back. And if they come at night, then we fight together." Eleanor nodded, filing away instructions with the same focused attention she'd given to learning the rifle. No questions about whether fighting was really necessary. No suggestions that maybe talking could resolve things. She understood what James had learned over 4 years on this mountain. Some situations don't have peaceful solutions. That evening, James laid out his plan. Tomorrow before dawn, he'd track back to the mining camp and do proper reconnaissance. Numbers, weapons, condition of the men. Anything that would help them understand what they were facing. Eleanor listened, then added her own observation. "We should vary our routines. If they've been watching, they know when you leave for trap lines. When I go to the barn, we should be unpredictable." James felt that shift again, the recognition that Eleanor thought tactically, not emotionally. "Smart. I'll stagger my departures. You do the same with animal care." They were planning like soldiers, he realized. Two people preparing to defend a position against superior numbers. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it felt oddly right. This was what partnership meant in a place like this. Not romance or comfort, but having someone who would stand with you when reality turned violent. Pre-dawn cold burned James's lungs as he moved through the forest, following yesterday's tracks back toward the mining camp. He'd left Eleanor sleeping, the rifle beside her bed, the door barred from inside per his instructions. The tracks led through dense pine forest, up a ravine where an old cart path had once allowed ore transport down to the valley. The camp appeared gradually through trees, Three ramshackle structures that had been miners' quarters, smoke rising from one of them. James positioned himself on high ground, hidden behind a fallen log, and watched. Four men emerged as morning light strengthened. James felt his blood run cold as he recognized one of them, Carl Brennan. James had seen wanted posters in the valley town last summer. Brennan was wanted for armed robbery in Denver, suspected in several murders. The reward was $200, which meant the man was considered extremely dangerous. The others James didn't recognize, but their bearing told him enough. Hard men, weathered by outdoor living, moving with the casual violence of people for whom hurting others was routine rather than exception. They were discussing something, voices carrying in the cold air. James caught fragments. Plenty of supplies in that cabin. Just one man? Saw the woman, though. Big one, but still. James's hands tightened on his rifle. They were planning something, debating timing and approach. The question wasn't if they'd attack, but when. He needed to get back to Eleanor. James moved carefully, leaving no obvious trail, but as he descended from his observation point, something made him freeze. A branch snap. Close. Too close. He turned slowly and found himself facing a fifth man, this one younger than the others, rifle already raised and aimed at James's chest. "Well now," the young man said, grinning to show missing teeth, "looks like we got ourselves a visitor." "Carl, we got company!" James calculated odds and didn't like them. The young man was 20 feet away, rifle steady, finger on the trigger. Any move James made would result in getting shot before he could bring his own weapon to bear. Footsteps approached through the trees. Carl Brennan appeared, taller than James remembered from the posters, with a scarred face that spoke of a violent life. He looked James over with the assessing gaze of a predator evaluating prey. "James Hartley," Brennan said. "That's your name, right? Got it from that supply driver when he came through. You're the one living in that nice cabin with all those supplies." James said nothing. Brennan smiled. "Not much for talking, are you? That's fine, I'll do the talking. See, we've been wintering up here, and it's been hard. Real hard. Cold, short on food, getting desperate. And then we see your place, all snug and warm, smoke from the chimney every day. Food, shelter, and that woman you've got with you." James felt rage building but kept his face neutral. "You come near my cabin, I'll kill you." Brennan laughed. "Will you now? One man against four. Sorry, 5 of us. That's brave talk for someone who's currently on the wrong end of a rifle." The young man with the gun on James looked nervous, his aim wavering slightly. Brennan noticed and his expression hardened. "Keep that steady, boy." He returns his attention to James. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to give you a chance to be smart. You leave. Take your woman, head down to the valley, and don't come back until spring. We'll use your cabin for the winter, eat your food, stay warm. Come spring, you can have it back. Nobody gets hurt." James met his eyes directly. "No," Brennan's smile faded. "Then you're choosing hard over easy. That's a mistake, maybe. But it's my mistake to make." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Brennan laughed again, but this time without humor. "You got 3 days," he said. 3 days to think about it. After that, we're coming for that cabin whether you're in it or not. And if you are," he let the threat hang. "Well, we'll do what needs doing." Brennan gestured, and the young man lowered his rifle. James didn't move, didn't trust this opening. "Go on," Brennan said. "Get back to your woman. Tell her she should convince you to be smart. Would be a shame if she got hurt because you're too stubborn to see reason." James backed away slowly, rifle ready, watching all 5 men until he was far enough and into the trees to risk turning his back. Then he ran. Eleanor was waiting when he burst through the cabin door, rifle in hand, her face tense with worry that eased slightly when she saw him unhurt. James told her everything. The 5 men, Carl Brennan's identity, the 3-day ultimatum. He watched her face pale, but her jaw set with determination. "We're not leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, this is our home." James moved to the window, scanning the tree line. "But they will come, and when they do, it won't be to negotiate." Eleanor absorbed this. "Then we need those 3 days to prepare better." They spent the afternoon creating defensive positions. James showed Eleanor where to shoot from if they had to defend the cabin. Corners that provided cover while offering clear fields of fire. They moved water and supplies to central locations so neither would be exposed during an attack. They practiced their response to various scenarios, rehearsing movements until they became automatic. That night, James slept with his rifle beside him, waking at every sound. His mind wouldn't stop calculating, 5 men against 2, terrible odds even with defensive advantage. But worse than the tactical concern was the knowledge that he'd brought Eleanor into danger. She'd come to his mountains seeking honest hardship, and he'd delivered that in abundance. But this violence wasn't the honest challenge of surviving winter. This was human evil, the kind James thought he'd escape by leaving civilization behind. He'd been wrong. Late December brought a brief respite from the worst weather. The days after the outlaw retreat were tense, James and Eleanor both waiting for the other men to return, for revenge or another attack that never came. On the evening of the third day, as they worked together to repair the shattered window with canvas and wooden slats, Eleanor broke the silence that had settled between them. "You asked me something before," she said quietly, holding the canvas taut while James nailed it into place. "Before the attack, about whether I was satisfied with our arrangement." James paused mid-swing, hammer raised. "I remember." Eleanor met his eyes directly. "You wanted to know if I hoped for something more than a business partnership." James lowered the hammer slowly. "What's your answer?" Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "I came here expecting practical partnership. What I've found is something that feels like it could have become more, if you want that." James set down his tools completely. Over the past weeks, Eleanor Morrison had proven herself capable, strong, and unshakably honest. She'd faced winter storms, outlaw attacks, and the weight of killing someone without breaking. "I want that," he said, "more than I've wanted anything in a long time." Eleanor's hand found his, her grip firm and warm. "Then we'll build it, the same way we built our defenses, our routines, our ability to survive up here together. Carefully and honestly." James pulled her closer, and Eleanor came willingly, fitting against his side with surprising naturalness. They stood like that for a long time, surrounded by the evidence of violence survived and danger overcome, two people choosing each other with clear eyes. Outside, the mountain winds sang through the pines. Inside, something new was taking root, something neither of them had expected to find in this isolated place. Partnership was becoming more professional. Glass shattered across the floor as the rifle shot echoed through the cabin. James dove for Eleanor, pulling her down as a second shot punched through the door. "Get the rifles," he shouted. Eleanor was already moving, crawling toward where they'd positioned the weapons. James grabbed his own, returning fire through the broken window. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness outside. 3, no 4 positions. They'd come early. Eleanor took position at the opposite window, firing steadily at the flashes. James heard her hit something, a cry of pain from the darkness, and felt grim satisfaction. She hadn't frozen, hadn't panicked. She was fighting. The attack lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. Shots came from multiple angles, probing their defenses, looking for weakness. James and Eleanor returned fire carefully, conserving ammunition, only shooting when they had clear targets. Then silence. James waited, rifle trained on the tree line, breathing hard. Beside him, Eleanor was equally tense, her face pale but focused. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, you?" "Just scratched from the glass." They stayed in position for another hour, but no further attack came. Finally, James risked moving to the broken window, using the barrel of his rifle to clear remaining glass shards. Dawn came slowly, revealing the damage. The cabin's door was splintered, the window destroyed, and blood trails led away into the forest from at least 2 positions. James examined the blood more closely. Heavy flow from one trail suggesting a serious wound. He followed it 20 yards into the trees and found what he'd half expected. Carl Brennan lay on his side in the snow, already frozen, eyes open and unseeing. Eleanor's shot had taken him in the chest, probably severing something vital. He'd made it this far before blood loss finished him. James returned to the cabin to find Eleanor standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. Her face was composed, but he could see the tremor in her hands. "I need to show you something," he said gently. He led her to Brennan's body. Eleanor looked down at the dead man without speaking. her expression unreadable. "That's Carl Brennan," James said. "He was wanted for murder." "Dangerous man. You saved our lives last night." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I killed someone. In self-defense. He was shooting at us. At our home." "I know." Her voice was steady but quiet. "I know it was necessary. Doesn't make it feel less heavy." James put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him slightly, accepting the comfort. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." They stood there in the snow, looking at the man Eleanor had killed, and James felt the weight of what frontier life actually meant. It wasn't just hard work and isolation. It was sometimes having to do violence to protect what was yours. Eleanor had proven she could do that. The question was what it would cost her. The other outlaws didn't return. James found their trail heading down mountain, abandoning the mining camp entirely. Whatever fight they'd had in them died with Brennan. Over the next few days, James and Eleanor repaired the damage to the cabin. They replaced the window with canvas temporarily until spring would allow proper repairs. They patched the door, reinforced weak points, and established new routines that assumed the possibility of future threats. Eleanor was quieter than before, processing what she'd done. James gave her space but stayed close, offering presence without demanding conversation. On the third day after the attack, Eleanor finally spoke about it while they worked side by side chopping firewood. "I used to wonder if I could do it. If the situation required it, could I actually kill someone?" James waited, giving her room to continue. "Now I know I can." Eleanor's axe bit into wood with precise force, and that's somehow worse than not knowing, because now there's no comfortable uncertainty. "I know what I'm capable of when I'm threatened." "That's not weakness," James said. "That's strength. The mountain demands that kind of strength." Eleanor set down her axe and looked at him directly. "Is that what you tell yourself about your partner dying? That the mountain demanded it?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. James paused, axe raised, and then lowered it slowly. "No," he admitted. "I told myself it was weakness, my failure, my inability to make the right choice. But maybe—" He stopped, thinking about Eleanor's earlier words about guilt and responsibility. Maybe it was just the cost of living in a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. Maybe we're both learning that strength and guilt aren't opposites. Eleanor's voice was soft. Maybe they coexist, and we just have to learn to carry both. James met her eyes and saw understanding there that went deeper than words. They were both carrying things now, him with Thomas Farrell's death, her with Carl Brennan's. Neither burden would ever disappear completely, but maybe shared weight was more bearable than solitary suffering. That night, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor returned to the conversation that had been interrupted by gunfire 3 nights earlier. "You asked if I was satisfied with our arrangement," she said. James looked up from the leather work he'd been doing. "Before we were attacked?" "Yes." Eleanor set aside her mending. "You wanted to know if I hoped for something more than a business partnership." James's heart rate picked up. "I did. Then my answer is yes." Eleanor's gaze was steady. "I came here expecting practical partnership. What I've found is something that feels like it could become more, if you want that." James set down his tools and moved to sit beside her. Over the past 3 weeks, Eleanor Morrison had proven herself capable, strong, and unshakably honest. She'd faced winter storms, outlaw attacks, and the weight of killing someone without breaking. She'd looked at James's guilt and shame and offered him a different perspective on carrying impossible weight. She'd become essential. "I want that," he said, "more than I've wanted anything in a long time." Eleanor's hand found his, her grip firm and warm. "Then we'll build it. The same way we built our defenses, our routines, our ability to survive up here together. Carefully and honestly." James pulled her closer and Eleanor came willingly, fitting against his side with surprising naturalness. They sat like that for a long time, watching fire dance in the hearth, 2 people who'd found each other through circumstance and chosen to stay through intention. Outside, the mountain winds sang through the pines. Inside, something new was taking root, something neither of them had expected to find in this isolated place. Partnership was becoming more. 2 damaged people were becoming something stronger than the sum of their individual survival. And for the first time since Thomas Farrell died, James Hartley felt like maybe he deserved a second chance. January brought deeper cold and the first real test of their supplies. The attack had cost them, broken window letting in cold despite the canvas, splintered door creating drafts, elevated vigilance requiring constant fire maintenance to prevent freezing while they took turns keeping watch. Eleanor managed their remaining stores with impressive efficiency, stretching provisions that James would have burned through in half the time. She knew exactly how to ration flour, when to use precious sugar versus making do without, which preserved foods would last longest. But even her careful management couldn't change the fundamental math. They were going through supplies faster than anticipated, and spring was still 3 months away. One evening, Eleanor laid out the numbers for James. Her expression was grave. If we maintain current consumption, we'll run out of flour by early March. Beans by mid-March. We'll have enough meat if your hunting continues successfully. But the staples, she shook her head. We'll be hungry before Calvin can get through with spring supplies. James had been worried about the same thing, but hearing Eleanor confirm it made the problem concrete. We can cut rations, he said. We're already cutting rations. Eleanor's voice was firm. Any less, and we'll be too weak to function. You need energy for trap lines. I need it for managing the homestead. Starving slowly isn't a solution. Then what do you suggest? Eleanor was quiet for a moment thinking. The debt collection letter is still coming in spring. We need money for that regardless. What if we accelerated earning it? Take on more dangerous work now, use the extra income to buy supplies when Calvin's first run comes through. James understood what she wasn't saying. More dangerous meant riskier trap lines at higher elevation, where fur quality was better but avalanche risk was substantial. Or it meant logging work, the kind that had killed Thomas. It's a bad gamble, he said. Risk my life now to maybe prevent starving later. Risk both our lives later if we do nothing. Eleanor met his eyes. I'm not asking you to be reckless, James. I'm asking us to be strategic about which risks we take. She was right. James hated that she was right, but denying reality wouldn't change it. There's high country trap lines I've avoided, he said slowly. Too dangerous alone. But if someone could watch for weather changes, signal if conditions shifted, I can do that. Eleanor's response was immediate. Teach me what to watch for. So they began planning. James would push into higher elevations, setting new trap lines where the fur quality justified the risk. Eleanor would establish a signal system, smoke patterns that would warn James if weather was turning dangerous, giving him time to retreat before being trapped above the tree line. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something, and something was better than passively waiting for disaster. James spent 2 days scouting the high country route, memorizing landmarks, identifying escape routes if storms caught him. Eleanor practiced her signal fires, perfecting the timing and smoke density that would carry messages across long distances. They were preparing for risk with the same careful attention they'd given to defending against the outlaws, because the mountain didn't stop being dangerous just because humans had already tried to kill them. On the third day of preparation, something happened that changed everything. James was outside splitting wood when he heard Eleanor call from the cabin, her voice sharp with urgency. He dropped the axe and ran, rifle already in hand, expecting another attack. Instead, he found Eleanor at the table, staring at a piece of paper with an expression he couldn't read. What is it? She looked up, and James saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Not fear, not determination. Something softer and more terrifying. Hope. I've been calculating, Eleanor said. Your winter furs, if prices hold, will bring about $180. We need $340 for the debt. That's $160 short. James nodded. I know. That's why the high country trap lines. But what if, Eleanor interrupted, we didn't need $160 more? What if we only needed $40? James frowned, not understanding. Where would we get $120? Eleanor set down the paper. It was covered in numbers, careful calculations in her precise handwriting. Carl Brennan had a bounty, $200, alive or dead. She let that sink in. He's dead on our property. His body is still frozen in the snow. When Calvin comes through in spring, we report it, collect the bounty. James felt his stomach twist. That's practical? Eleanor's voice was steady. Because it is. Brennan was wanted for murder. His death was self-defense. The state owes a bounty for his capture. We could use that money. It feels wrong, James said. Profiting from killing him. We're not profiting, we're surviving. Eleanor stood, moving to face him directly. James, I shot that man. I live with that every day. If his death, which I caused defending our home, can also solve the financial crisis threatening our future, then refusing the bounty is just wasteful guilt. It doesn't bring him back. It doesn't make me less responsible. It just makes us poorer. The logic was sound. James knew it was sound, but something in him resisted the idea of turning Eleanor's necessary violence into a financial transaction. Think about it, Eleanor said gently. We have a few months before Calvin returns, but that bounty could change everything. She returned to her chair, leaving James standing by the door with his thoughts churning. Brennan's frozen body was still out there in the trees. Come spring thaw, it would need to be dealt with regardless. Why not turn a grim necessity into an opportunity? Because it felt like profiting from death. But Eleanor was right. Refusing the bounty wouldn't resurrect Brennan or absolve her. It would just leave them financially desperate while a legal reward went unclaimed. That night, James lay awake thinking about the distinction between accepting consequences and exploiting them. By morning, he'd made his decision. We'll claim the bounty, he told Eleanor over breakfast. You're right, it's practical, and practical is what we need to survive up here. Eleanor nodded, relief evident in her face. Thank you, but we use it only for necessities, James continued. The debt, supplies, genuine needs, not luxury or excess. Agreed. Eleanor's tone was solemn, and she paused. I think we should give a portion to Brennan's family, if he has any. Not the whole amount, but something. To acknowledge that even necessary killing has costs. James looked at her with renewed respect. That's fair, more than fair. They spent the rest of the day preparing for James's high country expedition. He would leave tomorrow, be gone 4 days, return before the next storm system moved through. Eleanor would maintain the homestead and watch the weather, signaling if conditions changed. It was a risk, but measured risk was how you survived on the frontier. That evening, James found himself watching Eleanor as she prepared their dinner. She moved through the cabin with the confidence of someone who'd made this space her own, adjusting the fire without thinking, retrieving supplies from memory rather than search, humming softly in that unconscious way that meant she was content. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a stranger stepping off Calvin's wagon. Now she was the person James trusted to watch his back while he worked dangerous elevation, the person whose judgment he deferred to on household management, the person whose presence made this cabin feel like something more than a survival shelter. Somewhere along the way, Eleanor Morrison had become home. The realization should have terrified him. After 7 failures, after years of cultivating isolation, James had taught himself not to invest hope in other people. But Eleanor kept proving that maybe hope wasn't always foolish. Maybe sometimes it was just accurate assessment of reality. Later, as they sat by the fire, James voiced something he'd been thinking about since the attack. You could have run, he said, when the outlaws came. You could have hidden, let me fight alone. Nobody would have blamed you. Eleanor looked at him with surprise. Where would I have run to? This is my home too, I know, but James, I stayed through the blizzard because I chose to. I fought beside you because that's what partners do. Eleanor's voice was firm. I'm not some delicate thing that needs protecting from reality. I'm a woman who spent 14 years in conditions that killed people regularly. I know how to calculate risk and accept consequences. She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. You keep expecting me to break, to decide this is too hard and leave like the others did. But I'm not them. I knew what I was choosing when I came here, and every day since has only confirmed that this is where I belong. James felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for years. Not just belief in Eleanor, but belief in the possibility that maybe he deserved this, deserved partnership, companionship, something approaching happiness. I'm glad you stayed, he said simply. Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. So am I. The high country expedition would start tomorrow. But tonight, James and Eleanor sat together in their cabin, planning and preparing. Two people who'd found each other through circumstance and chosen to build something worth defending. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, their voices carrying through cold air. Inside, the fire crackled, and two humans planned survival with the same fierce determination that had kept them alive through everything the mountain and other humans had thrown at them. They would face winter together. They would survive spring together. And maybe, if they were fortunate, they would build a future that justified all the risk and pain required to reach it. James left before dawn, when the world existed in that gray half-light that was neither night nor morning. Eleanor stood in the doorway wrapped in a shawl, her breath creating clouds in air so cold it stung exposed skin. She tried to hide her worry, but James had seen it in the tightness around her eyes when she'd helped him pack supplies. 4 days, he reminded her. I'll be back before the next weather system moves through. I'll watch for your signals. Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hand lingered on his arm a moment longer than necessary. Be careful up there. James wanted to kiss her goodbye. They'd grown closer since the attack, small touches becoming natural. But something held him back. Instead, he squeezed her hand once and turned toward the high country. The ascent was brutal. James pushed through snow that came to his thighs in places, following animal trails when he could find them, breaking his own path when he couldn't. The altitude made breathing difficult, each lungful of thin air burning cold all the way down. But the higher he climbed, the better the signs became. Fresh tracks of marten and fox, the kind of animals whose pelts brought premium prices. He set his first trap at a narrow pass where tracks converged, then moved on to the next promising location. By the end of the first day, James had established a new trap line that extended his territory by 3 miles. Exhausting work, but potentially worth hundreds in fur sales if the catches were good. He made camp in a small cave he'd scouted during his earlier reconnaissance, building a fire just large enough for warmth without attracting attention. From this elevation, he could see the valley below, a vast white expanse broken only by dark lines of trees. Somewhere down there was his cabin, Eleanor tending the animals and keeping watch. The thought brought unexpected comfort. For 4 years, James had returned to an empty cabin, silence his only companion. Now there was someone waiting, someone who would notice if he didn't return, someone who mattered. The second day brought the first sign of trouble. James was checking his new traps, 3 catches already, good quality pelts, when he felt the ice beneath his feet shift. He froze, distributing his weight carefully, but the damage was done. The snow-covered stream he'd thought solid was actually only partially frozen, and his weight had cracked through. James felt himself dropping, icy water shocking his system as it poured into his boot. He scrambled backward, getting his other foot onto solid ground, but the damage was done. His right leg was soaked to the knee in water cold enough to kill. He needed shelter immediately. Fire, dry clothing. James made it back to his cave camp, but his leg was already losing feeling. He built up the fire, stripped off the soaked boot and wool sock, and found his emergency dry clothes. But even as warmth returned, he could see the damage. His foot was mottled red and white, the telltale signs of frostbite beginning. And where his boot had rubbed during the frantic trek back, there was an open wound, small but deep. James cleaned it as best he could, wrapped it in cloth torn from his spare shirt, and tried not to think about what infection meant in a place where the nearest doctor was a week's travel away. By the 3rd day, fever had set in. James knew he should retreat, get back to the cabin where Eleanor could help. But his traps had to be checked, or the animals would suffer needlessly, and the pelts needed collection. He forced himself through the routine, limping on his injured foot, fighting waves of dizziness and chills. The fever got worse as the day progressed. By the time James started his descent, he was barely coherent, navigating more on instinct than conscious thought. Somewhere in the darkness of the 3rd night, James collapsed. He remembered the snow, remembered thinking this was how it ended, alone in the high country, paying the price for risking too much. Then nothing. Eleanor saw the smoke signal change on the 3rd day. Instead of the steady pattern James had taught her, 3 puffs, pause, 3 puffs, the smoke from his camp was erratic and thin, like a fire barely maintained. Something was wrong. She'd been watching for weather changes, ready to signal if storms approached. But this was different. This was James's fire dying, which meant he was either injured or too sick to maintain it. Eleanor made her decision in seconds. She loaded a pack with medical supplies, food, and extra clothing. She took both rifles and as much ammunition as she could carry. Then she set out following James's trail up the mountain. The climb was harder than anything she'd attempted before. Eleanor's size, usually a disadvantage in society's eyes, became an asset on the mountain. The weight gave her stability in deep snow, and years of factory work had built strength that served her now. She climbed through the afternoon and into evening, following James's tracks by the light of a nearly full moon. Her lungs burned from the altitude. Her legs screamed with exhaustion, but she kept moving, because James was up there somewhere, and he needed help. Eleanor found him just after midnight, unconscious in the snow 50 yards from his camp. His fire had died hours ago, and he was hypothermic, his skin cold to the touch, his breathing shallow. She got him back to the cave through sheer determination and the leverage physics provided. Once inside, she rebuilt his fire into a roaring blaze, stripped off his wet clothing, and wrapped him in every dry blanket she could find. Then she found the wound. The infection was obvious even to her untrained eye. The area around the cut had swollen to twice normal size, angry red streaks radiating outward. When Eleanor touched it, James moaned in his unconscious state, his body reacting to pain even when his mind couldn't. She had limited medical knowledge, what she'd learned from factory injuries in one terrible winter when illness had swept through her boarding house. But she understood infection meant heat, swelling, and the potential for blood poisoning that could kill. Eleanor cleaned the wound with water she'd boiled over the fire, used the knife James kept razor sharp to drain the infected fluid, and packed it with a poultice made from herbs she'd found in his supplies. Then she wrapped it carefully and prayed it would be enough. James's fever climbed through the night. Eleanor stayed beside him, bathing his face with cool water, forcing liquid between his lips when she could, talking to him in hopes her voice might anchor him to consciousness. "You have to fight this." Her words were firm, allowing no room for his body to surrender. "You promised me 4 days. I'm holding you to that promise." The fever dreams began around dawn. James thrashed, his words tumbling out in fragments that made no sense until Eleanor realized he was reliving the accident that had killed Thomas Farrell. "The rope," James mumbled, his voice thick with fever. "I saw it fraying. Thomas said to replace it. I said no." Eleanor listened, piecing together the story she'd only heard in outline before. James's guilt ran deeper than she'd understood. He hadn't just made a bad call, he'd seen the danger, been warned explicitly, and dismissed it because management was pushing for quota. "It should have been me," James said, clearer now, his eyes open but unseeing. "Under that tree. Should have been me." His fever broke on the second day of Eleanor's vigil. She woke from an exhausted half-doze to find James watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in 48 hours. "You came," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Eleanor's relief was so intense it made her hands shake. "Of course I came. Where else would I go?" James tried to sit up and failed, his strength depleted. "What happened? You nearly died of hypothermia and infection." Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, hiding the terror she'd felt. "Your foot went into ice water, the wound got infected, and you had enough fever to mumble every guilty thought you've ever had." James's face flushed with something beyond fever. "What did I say?" "Everything." Eleanor met his eyes. "About Thomas, about the rope, about why you came to the mountain, about believing you deserved to suffer alone." James looked away, shame evident in every line of his body. Eleanor reached out and turned his face back toward her. "Your partner made his own choice to keep working despite his doubts, just like my husband made his choice to walk into that river." "Your husband," James started, "killed himself." Eleanor's voice was steady despite the pain of saying it aloud. "Thomas didn't die of consumption. That was the story I told people because the truth was too shameful. But the truth is that poverty broke him, and he decided death was better than continuing to fail." She pulled out the photograph she'd been carrying since leaving Massachusetts, the one of a young man with hopeful eyes. "This is Thomas. We married when I was 19. He was a weaver, skilled at his trade. But when the mills started laying off workers, he couldn't find other employment. We got poorer, hungrier, more desperate. And one January night, he left a note saying he was worth more dead than alive. The insurance money would save me. Eleanor's hands tightened on the photograph. But insurance doesn't pay for suicide. So I got his body and his debts and 9 years of wondering if I could have saved him somehow. If I'd been prettier, better at stretching money, more encouraging, maybe he would have found something worth living for. James reached for her hand despite his weakness. Eleanor, she squeezed his fingers. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that we both carry guilt for deaths we didn't cause. Thomas chose surrender. Your partner chose to follow a bad order. Neither of those choices was ours to control. But I could have prevented it, James said. Could you? Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. Could you have overruled your bosses who were demanding quota? Could you have refused work without losing your job, leaving Thomas's family without any support? Or were you both trapped in a system that valued production over lives? James was quiet, processing this perspective he'd never allowed himself to consider. We survived things that broke other people, Eleanor continued. That's not shame, that's strength. And punishing yourself by living in isolation doesn't honor the dead. It just wastes the life they don't have anymore. The words hit James like physical blows, each one dismantling a piece of the wall he'd built around his guilt. He'd spent 4 years on this mountain believing suffering was atonement, that if he just hurt enough, it would balance the scales. But Eleanor was offering him a different truth. That survival wasn't betrayal, that living wasn't dishonoring the dead, that maybe he deserved a second chance. I don't know how to stop feeling guilty, he admitted. You don't stop. Eleanor's smile was sad but understanding. You just learned to carry it alongside everything else. The way I carry Thomas's death alongside my determination to build something better. The way I carry killing Carl Brennan alongside the knowledge that I protected our home. She leaned closer, her dark eyes intense. Guilt and strength aren't opposites, James. They coexist in people who care enough to take responsibility. The question is whether you'll let guilt define you or just inform you. James felt something shift in his chest, a weight that didn't disappear but somehow became more bearable. You're remarkable, you know that? Eleanor's laugh was quiet. I'm practical. There's a difference. They stayed in the cave another full day while James regained enough strength to attempt the descent. Eleanor tended his wound, monitored his fever, and kept the fire burning. At night, she slept beside him, not for romance but for shared warmth in the bitter cold. But the proximity created its own intimacy. James woke once to find Eleanor's head resting on his shoulder, her breathing deep and even in sleep. She'd exhausted herself caring for him. This woman who barely knew him 3 weeks ago and now had climbed a mountain to save his life. He was falling in love with her, James realized. Maybe had been since she'd stood beside him during the outlaw attack without flinching. Maybe since she'd looked at his rough cabin and called it solid. Maybe since the moment she'd stepped off Calvin's wagon with clear eyes and no illusions. Eleanor Morrison had come to his mountain seeking honest hardship. What she'd found was partnership, purpose, and a man who was beginning to understand that maybe he didn't have to earn the right to be loved. Maybe he just had to accept it. The descent took 2 full days, with James leaning heavily on Eleanor whenever the terrain got steep. She never complained about supporting his weight, never suggested they should rest longer than necessary. She simply adapted to his limitations and got them both down the mountain safely. When their cabin finally came into view, James felt emotion tighten his throat. Home. Not just a structure he'd built, but a place he shared with someone who'd proven she would literally climb mountains for him. Inside, Eleanor settled James by the fire and went to tend the animals she'd left for nearly 4 days. The goats bleated their complaints. The chickens had clearly been stress molting, but everything had survived her absence. That evening, as they ate the first hot meal either had enjoyed in days, James voiced what had been building in him since the fever broke. I want this to be real. Not just a practical arrangement, a real marriage. Eleanor set down her spoon and looked at him steadily. What changed? You climbed a mountain to save my life. You sat with me through fever dreams and heard my worst confessions and didn't run. You told me truths about yourself that you'd hidden from everyone else. James met her eyes. If that's not the foundation for a real marriage, I don't know what is. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and James felt his heart rate pick up with uncertainty. Then she smiled, and the warmth in her expression eased every doubt. I've wanted that since the blizzard, she admitted. When we sealed the wall gap together and I realized we were genuinely partners. Not employer and employee, not convenience and necessity. Partners. James reached across the table for her hand. Then we agree. This is real. Eleanor's fingers laced through his. This is real. That night, they shared the bedroom for the first time, and the partnership that had been growing for weeks became something deeper. Eleanor was as practical about intimacy as she was about everything else. Focused, unhesitant, completely present. And James found that her directness, the same quality that had startled him initially, now felt like a gift. No games, no pretense. Just two people choosing each other with clear eyes and honest hearts. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Eleanor warm beside him, James felt peace for the first time since Thomas Farrell's death. The guilt was still there. Eleanor had been right that it never fully disappeared, but it no longer defined him. He was more than his worst decision. He was also the man who'd built this cabin, survived 4 brutal winters, and somehow found a woman strong enough to love him without needing him to be perfect. February brought gentler weather and a deepening of everything between James and Eleanor. They worked together with the easy rhythm of long partnership, each knowing instinctively when to step forward and when to give space. James's foot healed slowly, the infection finally clearing thanks to Eleanor's careful tending. He couldn't check his high-elevation trap lines yet, but the lower routes produced steady catches that would help offset lost time. Eleanor took over more of the outdoor work, proving herself capable with an axe and surprisingly good with the goats. She'd found her own rhythm on the mountain, adapted to its demands without losing herself in them. One morning in late February, Eleanor emerged from the bedroom looking pale. James immediately set down the leather he'd been working and moved to her side. "Are you sick?" Eleanor shook her head, though her pallor suggested otherwise. "Just nausea, it'll pass." James studied her face, noting details he'd been too focused on his own recovery to see before. Eleanor had been tired lately, going to bed earlier, sleeping later, and now nausea. "Are you—" He stopped, uncertain how to ask. Eleanor met his eyes and nodded slowly. "I think so. It's early yet, but the signs are there." James felt his world tilt. A baby. They were going to have a baby. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. This mountain was brutal to adults. What would it mean for a child? But beneath the fear was something else, hope, the kind of hope he taught himself not to feel. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Suspected for 2 weeks. Didn't want to say anything until I was certain." Eleanor's hand moved to her stomach in an unconscious protective gesture. Is this something you want?" James pulled her close, feeling the solid warmth of her in his arms. "Yes. God, yes. It's terrifying and probably foolish and absolutely something I want." Eleanor relaxed against him. "Good, because it's happening whether we're ready or not." They spent the rest of February preparing in small ways, James reinforcing the cabin structures, Eleanor beginning to sew tiny clothes from fabric scraps. Neither spoke about the risks, about childbirth in remote wilderness, about raising a child in such isolation, but both thought about it in the quiet hours. March arrived with the first real thaw. Ice began breaking up in streams, snow melting from south-facing slopes, and the mountains slowly transitioning from winter's grip toward spring's promise. And with the thaw came Calvin Tucker's wagon, struggling through mud that had replaced snow as the primary obstacle to travel. James and Eleanor went out to meet him, both feeling the relief of seeing another human face after months of isolation. Calvin climbed down with a groan, stretching his back. "Made it through," he announced. "Earliest spring run in 5 years, thanks to this warm weather." He looked at James and Eleanor with open curiosity. "Surprised to see you both still here, if I'm being honest." "We're both still here," Eleanor confirmed, "and staying." Calvin grinned. "Well, I'll be damned. Congratulations, then." He began unloading supplies. "Got your usual order plus some extras you'd requested last fall. Also got news." James helped with the unloading. "What kind of news?" "The outlaw situation got resolved." Calvin's expression turned serious. Marshall came through in January, tracked down the remaining men from that mining camp, got them in custody down in Denver. When they mentioned Carl Brennan had been wintering up here, the marshal wanted confirmation. James exchanged a glance with Eleanor. We can confirm that. Brennan attacked our cabin. Eleanor killed him in self-defense. Calvin nodded. That's what I figured. Marshall will want a statement come summer, but he said to tell you there's no question of legal trouble. Clear case of defense. Also, he pulled out a document. There's a bounty, $200. Marshall authorized payment based on my confirmation of the body. Eleanor took the paper, her hand steady. This changes things. It certainly does, said a new voice. James turned to see a second man climbing down from the wagon, this one dressed in an Eastern-style suit completely inappropriate for mountain travel. He was perhaps 50, with the calculating eyes of someone accustomed to assessing people's vulnerabilities. Who are you? James asked, though he already suspected. The man pulled out official-looking papers. Henry Aldrich, representative of Lowell Savings and Trust, Massachusetts. I'm here regarding the outstanding debt of Eleanor Morrison. Eleanor's face had gone pale again, but her voice remained steady. That debt was settled. Aldrich smiled without warmth. According to our ledgers, Mrs. Morrison, you have an outstanding balance of $340 plus accrued interest. I've come to collect. James moved to stand beside Eleanor. That's impossible. My wife paid that debt for 14 years. Aldrich's smile widened. Ah, but did she? Because our records show consistent partial payments, none of which satisfied the principal amount. With interest compounding, the debt has actually grown. He laid out documents on the wagon bed, pages of numbers in neat columns, payment dates, interest calculations. To James's untrained eye, it looked official and damning. This is fraud, Eleanor said quietly, but with absolute conviction. You're inventing charges to extract more money. Aldrich's expression hardened. These are legal documents, Mrs. Morrison. If you dispute them, you're welcome to pursue resolution through the courts. Of course, that will take time and considerable expense, more than you likely have. The alternative is simple. Pay the debt now and this matter is resolved. How much? James asked. With current interest, $360. Aldrich produced another document, and I have legal authority, granted by Massachusetts courts, to seize Mrs. Morrison for debt servitude if payment is not forthcoming. James felt rage building, but forced his voice to remain calm. She's my wife now, under my protection and responsibility. Aldrich had shook his head. The debt preceded your marriage, Mr. Hartley. Legally, it remains hers alone unless you choose to assume it, and debt servitude is recognized by mutual agreement between Massachusetts and Colorado territories. I have a writ authorizing her transport back east if payment cannot be made. He looked at Eleanor with false sympathy. I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Morrison, but you made these debts. They must be satisfied. Eleanor's hands had clenched into fists, but her voice stayed level. When do you require payment? I'll return in 8 weeks, Aldrich said. That should give you adequate time to arrange finances. 8 weeks from today, I expect either $360 or Mrs. Morrison's agreement to return east for servitude. James wanted to throw the man off his property, but violence would only make things worse. Instead, he met Aldrich's eyes with all the coldness he could muster. You'll get your money, Aldrich smiled again. I do hope so. It would be unfortunate if Mrs. Morrison had to leave this charming mountain home. He climbed back onto Calvin's wagon. Calvin looked apologetic but helpless. He was just the driver, caught in the middle of something beyond his control. The wagon pulled away, leaving James and Eleanor standing in the mud with the weight of an impossible deadline crushing down on them. $360. James had the bounty now, $200. His winter furs would bring perhaps $180 if he was lucky. That was $380 total, just barely enough. But selling the furs would take time, finding buyers, negotiating prices, and Aldrich had given them only 8 weeks. Eleanor was trembling now, all her careful control breaking down as the reality sank in. I'm so sorry. I thought I was free. I thought coming here meant escaping all of that. James pulled her close. We'll figure this out. How? Eleanor's voice was desperate. $360 is everything you've earned all winter, and we still need supplies to survive until you can trap again next season. If we pay Aldrich, we'll starve. If we don't, I won't let him take you." The words were simple, absolute. James didn't know how he'd keep that promise, but he would. Because Eleanor was his wife, his partner, the mother of his unborn child. She'd climbed a mountain to save his life. He would move heaven and earth to save hers. James spent the night after Aldrich's visit doing calculations that never added up right. No matter how he arranged the numbers, the math was brutal. 200 from Brennan's bounty plus 180 from Furs equaled 380, barely enough to cover the debt with $20 remaining. Not enough to buy supplies for the coming year. Not enough to prepare for the baby Eleanor carried. Pay the debt and starve slowly, or refuse and lose Eleanor to servitude that would kill her just as surely. Neither option was acceptable. By dawn, James had made a decision he knew Eleanor would hate. He found her in the kitchen, already battling morning nausea while trying to prepare breakfast. The sight of her, strong, capable Eleanor brought low by the basic biology of pregnancy, hardened his resolve. "There's logging work available down in the valley," he said without preamble. "High-risk contracts that pay premium rates because of the danger involved." Eleanor's hands stilled on the bread she'd been slicing. "How much danger?" James met her eyes. "The kind that killed Thomas Farrell. Widowmakers, unstable timber, avalanche zones. But the pay is $200 for 6 weeks of work if I can deliver the quota." "Shh." "No," Eleanor's voice was flat, absolute. "You're not doing that. We don't have a choice." James moved closer, keeping his tone gentle but firm. "The bounty and Furs won't be enough for both the debt and survival. This logging contract gets us clear of Aldrich with enough left over to restock supplies. You could die." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her dark eyes intense. "Just like Thomas did. Just like you almost did from that infected foot. And then what? I'm alone on this mountain, pregnant, with no way to survive, and debt collectors still coming for me. I'll be careful. You can't promise that." "No one can promise that when they're working with widowmakers." Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "James, I didn't climb that mountain to save your life, just so you could throw it away 6 weeks later." James pulled her close despite her resistance. "What's the alternative? Let Aldrich take you? Watch them drag you back east to work yourself to death in some factory? Our child growing up without knowing either of us?" Eleanor trembled against him, and James realized she was crying. Silent tears that she tried to hide by pressing her face against his chest. "I can't lose you," she whispered. "Not now. Not when we've finally built something real. You won't lose me." James lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm going to take this contract. I'm going to be excessively careful, and I'm going to come back. Because I have too much to live for now." Eleanor searched his face, clearly wanting to argue further, but recognizing the same truth James had accepted. They were trapped between terrible choices, and this was the only path that offered hope of keeping them together. "Promise me something," she said finally. "Anything. If it gets too dangerous, if you see conditions that remind you of what killed Thomas, you walk away." Eleanor's grip on his shirt tightened. "The money isn't worth your life. We'll find another way. I promise." But even as James said it, he knew the promise was hollow. If the contract was their only real chance, he'd see it through regardless of risk. Because losing Eleanor to debt servitude wasn't an option he could survive. They spent the next 2 days preparing. James would leave Eleanor for 6 weeks, longer than they'd been apart since she arrived. The cabin needed to be fully stocked, the animals secured, and Eleanor trained in every task that would fall to her in his absence. The pregnancy complicated everything. Eleanor was barely 2 months along, still suffering daily nausea, and the physical demands of managing the homestead alone would be enormous. But when James suggested she stay with neighbors, the nearest family was Sarah Colton, 8 miles away, Eleanor refused. "This is my home," she said simply. "I'm not leaving it." So James taught her everything he could think of. How to handle the horse if patience got ornery, where to find the hidden medical supplies if she got injured, the exact route to Sarah's place if emergency made the journey necessary. Most importantly, he taught her advanced rifle work, not just target shooting, but rapid reloading, shooting from cover, handling the weapon while moving. because the mountain was dangerous in ways that went beyond weather and wildlife. "You're preparing me for war," Eleanor observed, after a particularly intensive practice session. "I'm preparing you to survive alone." James reloaded her rifle with practiced efficiency. 6 weeks is a long time. Anything could happen. What he didn't say was that his nightmares had started again. Dreams of Eleanor alone, the cabin under attack, himself too far away to help. The outlaws were gone, but the mountain attracted desperate people, and a woman alone was always vulnerable. On the evening before his departure, James presented Eleanor with something he'd been working on in stolen moments over the past weeks. A wooden box, similar to the one she'd given him for Christmas but larger, with her initials carved into the lid. Inside was a letter sealed. Eleanor looked at him questioningly. "If something happens to me," James said, his throat tight, "if I don't come back, there's information in there, where the money is hidden, how to contact Calvin for emergency transport. People you can trust, everything you'd need to survive alone." Eleanor's hands shook as she took the box. "You're coming back. I plan to. But I need to know you'll be taken care of if I'm wrong." That night they made love with the desperation of people who understood how fragile their happiness was. James memorized every detail: the warmth of Eleanor's skin, the sound of her breathing, the way she held him like he was something precious rather than damaged. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Eleanor spoke into the silence. "When you come back, we need to talk about the future. Real planning, not just surviving day to day." James felt hope flicker despite the circumstances. What kind of future? The kind with a baby who needs parents who aren't constantly fighting for basic survival. Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness. "I don't regret coming here, James, but I want our child to have better than what we had growing up. Stability, safety, the chance to be a child instead of a laborer. We'll build that," James promised, "starting with getting clear of this debt." The logging camp was exactly as brutal as James remembered. 40 men working in conditions designed to maximize output with minimal concern for safety, overseen by foremen who cared only about quota. The company paid well because the mortality rate demanded it. James was assigned to a crew working high-slope timber, the most dangerous location because of avalanche risk and unstable ground. The trees here were massive old growth that required expert rigging to bring down safely, and even then the margin for error was razor thin. His first day back, James saw 3 near misses: a rope that snapped under tension, a tree that fell 10 feet from where it was supposed to, a worker who slipped on ice and nearly went over a cliff edge. Each incident reminded him exactly why he'd fled this work 4 years ago. But the pay was real. $200 for 6 weeks of quota delivery. James threw himself into the work with focused intensity, driven by the image of Eleanor alone on the mountain, waiting for him to return with their salvation. The crew boss was a man named Frank Mercer, scarred and missing 2 fingers on his left hand. He recognized James from before Thomas's death and made no effort to hide his contempt. "Thought you ran off to hide in the mountains," Mercer said the first day. "Guess you need money bad enough to risk dying like your partner did." James bit back the angry response and focused on his work. Mercer's opinion meant nothing compared to Eleanor's safety. But Mercer kept pushing, constant comments about cowards who ran from accidents, about men who couldn't handle real work. The other crew members picked up on it, and James found himself somewhat isolated, the outsider who'd abandoned them after Thomas died. He endured it because he had to, because every insult was another dollar toward freedom from Aldrich's threat. The work was relentless. 12-hour days in conditions that ranged from merely dangerous to actively suicidal. James watched men get injured regularly: crushed fingers, broken bones. One man who took a branch to the head and never woke up. The company buried him in an unmarked grave and docked his pay for the lost work time. This was the world Eleanor had escaped by coming to the mountain. Factory work that ground people down until they were used up and discarded. James worked beside men who were already broken, just going through motions until something killed them or they got too injured to continue. At night, lying in his bunk in the crowded bunkhouse, James thought about Eleanor. She would be managing the evening animal care now, banking the fire for overnight, preparing the simple dinner they'd shared so many times. He'd been gone 2 weeks, with 4 more stretching ahead. The loneliness was worse than during his years of solitude. Then he'd known no alternative. Now he knew exactly what he was missing. Letters were impossible. No mail service to the remote logging camp. Eleanor had no way of knowing if he was alive or dead, and he had no way of knowing if she was safe. The uncertainty gnawed at him during every quiet moment. Focus on the work. Get through 6 weeks. Go home to Eleanor. The mantra kept him going through the worst moments. Back at the cabin, Eleanor was discovering exactly how much James had been doing that she'd taken for granted. Managing the animals alone meant hauling water in quantities that strained her pregnant body. Chopping firewood to maintain heat meant hours of exhausting labor. Simple repairs to equipment became major challenges without James's strength and expertise. But Eleanor was nothing if not determined. She broke tasks into smaller pieces, worked steadily rather than rushing, and solved problems with the same methodical thinking she brought to everything else. The nausea was worst in the mornings, and sometimes so severe she couldn't keep food down. Those days were hardest, feeling weak and sick while knowing the animal still needed care, the fire still needed tending, and the cabin still required maintenance. On particularly bad days, Eleanor thought about James's suggestion that she stay with Sarah Colton. The widow lived with her grown son 8 miles away, and both had been kind during the brief interactions Eleanor had experienced. Having help, having company, having someone to call on if things went wrong, all of that was tempting. But leaving the cabin felt like admitting defeat. This was her home, the place she'd fought for and defended. Walking away even temporarily seemed wrong. So Eleanor endured alone, counting days until James's return. 3 weeks into his absence, the first real crisis hit. Eleanor woke to find one of the goats down, clearly sick with bloat from eating something that disagreed with her. The animal's stomach was distended, her breathing labored, and without treatment, she would die. Eleanor knew the basics. James had explained them during her training. She needed to relieve the gas pressure in the goat's stomach, either by inducing vomiting or, in severe cases, puncturing the rumen with a hollow tube. Her hands shook as she prepared the equipment. She'd never done this alone, never been solely responsible for an animal's survival. But the goat was suffering, and Eleanor was all she had. The procedure was gruesome and terrifying. Eleanor forced the tube down the goat's throat, felt the resistance of muscle and tissue, then the release as gas began venting. The smell was awful. Her stomach heaved, but she held steady until the goat's breathing eased. The animal survived. Eleanor collapsed beside her, shaking with reaction, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of tears before pulling herself together and continuing with the day's work. That night, sitting alone by the fire, Eleanor understood something about herself she'd never fully articulated. She was capable of far more than society had ever allowed her to attempt. Factory work had trained her to endure, but the mountain was teaching her to thrive despite impossible circumstances. The realization brought unexpected peace. Whatever happened with the debt, whatever came next, Eleanor knew she could survive it, because she'd already survived worse. James reached the 4-week mark with quota nearly met. Another 2 weeks and he'd have earned the full 200, enough to guarantee Eleanor's freedom when combined with the bounty and furs. But that's when things went wrong. The morning started normally, crews assigned, equipment distributed, weather assessed. Frank Mercer was in a foul mood, pushing everyone harder than usual, complaining that they were falling behind schedule. James and his crew were rigging a massive old-growth tree on steep slope, the kind of work that required absolute precision because one mistake could send hundreds of tons of timber sliding downhill, crushing everything in its path. They were halfway through the rig when James noticed it. The main support rope was frayed, not obviously, but visible if you look closely at the section that would bear maximum weight during the fall. The same kind of wear that had killed Thomas Farrell. James called for a halt. "Rope needs replacing before we pull." Mercer appeared, annoyed at the delay. "Let me see." He examined the rope, found the frayed section, and shrugged. "It'll hold for one more pull. We replace it after." The words sent ice through James's veins. Exact same thing he'd said to Thomas. Same casual dismissal of visible danger. Same prioritization of schedule over safety. "No," James's voice was flat. "We replace it now or I walk." Mercer's face flushed with anger. You're not in charge here, Hartley. I say it holds. It holds. And I say I'm not working with faulty equipment. James began gathering his tools. You want to risk your crew's lives, do it without me. The other workers had gone silent, watching this confrontation with wary eyes. Everyone knew challenging Mercer meant getting blacklisted from logging work, possibly from all contract labor in the territory. But James thought about Eleanor, alone and pregnant, waiting for him to come home. Thought about the promise he'd made to walk away if conditions reminded him of what killed Thomas. This was that moment. You walk now, Mercer said coldly. You forfeit all pay. Company policy. You don't complete the contract, you don't get paid. James felt his stomach drop. 4 weeks of brutal work, of enduring insults and isolation, all for nothing if he walked away now. The $200 that meant Eleanor's freedom, gone. But staying meant risking his life on equipment he knew was dangerous, meant potentially leaving Eleanor alone and pregnant with no support, meant becoming the same person who'd killed Thomas through willful negligence. James looked at the frayed rope, then at Mercer's challenging expression, then at the crew members who wouldn't meet his eyes. He made his choice. I'm out. The walk away from that camp was the longest of James's life. Every step felt like tearing away his last chance to save Eleanor. But every step also felt like honoring the promise he'd made, to her and to himself. He would not become the man who sacrificed safety for schedule, even if it meant losing everything. James made it back to the cabin 6 days later, exhausted and empty-handed. He'd pushed hard, traveling almost nonstop, driven by the need to see Eleanor and face whatever came next together. The cabin appeared as he rounded the final bend, smoke rising from the chimney, animals visible in the barn enclosure. Everything looked intact, peaceful, normal. Then the door opened and Eleanor emerged, rifle in hand, her eyes scanning the tree line before focusing on him. The relief that crossed her face when she recognized him was so intense it nearly broke him. You're early, she lowered the rifle, moving down the steps despite the awkwardness of her growing belly. What happened? James closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. I walked away. Couldn't do it. Couldn't risk dying like Thomas because some foreman cared more about quota than lives. Eleanor held him tight, her face pressed against his chest. Good. I'm glad you're alive, more than I'm glad about any amount of money. But we don't have the money now. James pulled back to meet her eyes. I forfeited the contract. We've got the bounty and whatever the furs bring, but it won't be enough for Aldrich and supplies both. Eleanor's expression was calm, accepting. Then we'll figure something else out. We always do. Her certainty steadied something in James. They went inside together and Eleanor prepared food while James told her everything. The dangerous conditions, the frayed rope, Mercer's ultimatum, his decision to leave. You kept your promise, Eleanor said when he finished. You walked away when it got too dangerous. That matters more than money. But Aldrich is still coming. James felt the weight of that deadline pressing down. 4 weeks until he returns, and we're short at least $100. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she retrieved something from the bedroom, her wedding band, a simple silver ring with small garnets. This is worth maybe $30, she said, and I have a few other pieces of jewelry from before. Not much, but something. James felt his throat tighten. Eleanor, no. That's yours. It's metal and stones. Our marriage is what we built, not what we wear. Eleanor's voice was firm. If selling this helps keep us together, then it's well worth the trade. But James was already shaking his head, an idea forming. Wait, let me think. He spent that evening doing calculations with Eleanor, listing every asset they had. The furs would bring 180. Brennan's bounty was 200. Eleanor's jewelry might add 30. That was 410, enough for the debt with 50 left over. Not enough for supplies, but enough to buy time. We pay Aldrich, James said slowly, clear the debt completely. Then we use the remaining 50 to buy absolute essentials, flour, salt, ammunition. We go lean for the next few months, supplement with hunting and foraging, and rebuild our reserves slowly. Eleanor nodded. It'll be hard, but we've done hard before. There's something else. James met her eyes. Once the debt is clear, we're free, really free. We can make decisions based on what we want, not what we owe. Maybe we take on smaller, safer contracts, build up slowly instead of gambling everything on high-risk work. I like that plan. Eleanor reached for his hand, slow and steady, building something sustainable instead of constantly fighting crisis. That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Eleanor's wedding ring, about the symbolism of her offering to sell it. She'd meant what she said. The ring wasn't their marriage, but it still felt wrong to take something precious from her when he'd failed to earn the money he'd promised. By morning, he'd made a decision. James spent the next 3 days working in the small workshop area of the cabin, carving with the focus and precision that had made him a good carpenter before he'd turned to logging. Eleanor watched with curiosity, but didn't ask questions, respecting his need to work through whatever he was processing. On the fourth day, James presented her with what he'd made, a ring carved from mountain oak, sanded smooth and polished with beeswax until it gleamed golden in the firelight. Simple but beautiful, sized perfectly for Eleanor's finger. "What's this?" she asked, though her smile suggested she understood. "Your real wedding ring." James took her hand gently. "The one nobody can take from us or put a price on. Made from this mountain, from this place we built together." He slipped it onto her finger, replacing the silver band she removed without hesitation. "Paper and metal are just symbols," he said. "This, us, this cabin, what we've survived together, that's real." Eleanor looked at the wooden ring, then at James, and he saw tears in her eyes. "It's perfect. We'll sell your silver ring to Aldrich if we need the extra money. But you'll wear this one. Made from our mountain, our home, our life." Eleanor pulled him close and kissed him with all the emotion she usually kept controlled. "Thank you for this, for coming home alive, for choosing us over money." "Always," James said against her lips. "Always you." The final 2 weeks before Aldrich's return passed quickly. James hunted successfully, bringing in game that stretched their food supplies. Eleanor continued managing the homestead despite the pregnancy, making everything harder. Together, they prepared for the confrontation they knew was coming. Calvin arrived exactly on schedule, wagon loaded with supplies. And beside him rode Henry Aldrich, looking smug and certain of his victory. James and Eleanor met them outside the cabin, presenting a united front. Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Morrison. Aldrich climbed down from the wagon, brushing trail dust from his suit. "I trust you've had adequate time to arrange payment. We have your money." James's voice was level, giving nothing away. Aldrich's smile widened. "Excellent. The full $360? Every cent." Eleanor stepped forward with the envelope they'd prepared. Brennan's bounty certificate, redeemable in Denver for $200. Cash from our first sales for $160. Total of $360 as demanded. Aldrich took the envelope, examining the contents carefully. After a long moment, his expression soured. "There's still the matter of interest accrual during the collection period." "No," James moved to stand beside Eleanor. "You said $360. We're paying $360. If you want to claim additional charges, you can take it up with a territorial judge." Aldrich's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening legal action, Mr. Hartley?" "I'm stating facts." James kept his voice calm despite the anger building. "You claimed a debt. We're paying it in full. Any attempt to extract additional money beyond what you specified is fraud, and we'll pursue it as such." Calvin cleared his throat from the wagon. "He's right, Mr. Aldrich. You told me the amount was $360. I heard you say it clear." Aldrich looked between them, clearly calculating whether pushing further was worth the risk. Finally, he snatched the envelope with poorly concealed frustration. "Fine. The debt is satisfied." He pulled out a document and signed it with angry flourishes. "This confirms full payment and releases Mrs. Morrison from all claims related to the estate of Thomas and Catherine Morrison." Eleanor took the release document, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they'd just accomplished. "We're done then, for now." Aldrich's tone carried a threat, though I'd advise you to be more careful with future financial obligations. Not everyone is as reasonable as Lowell Savings and Trust. He climbed back onto the wagon, clearly eager to leave. Calvin gave James and Eleanor an apologetic look before driving away, carrying Aldrich back toward the valley. They watched until the wagon disappeared around the bend. Then Eleanor turned to James, and the relief on her face mirrored his own. "We're free." James pulled her close, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms, the slight swell of her belly pressing against him. Free. Really, truly free. No more debt hanging over them. No more fear of Eleanor being dragged back east. No more shadow of her past dictating their future. They stood there in the spring sunshine, holding each other, until Eleanor pulled back with a smile. "Now what? Now we build." James looked at their cabin, their land, the mountain that had become home. "We prepare for the baby. We establish sustainable income. We create the life we want instead of the one we're forced into." Eleanor nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. "I like that plan." That evening, as they shared dinner by firelight, James looked across the table at his wife and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. They had each other. They had a home they defended and earned. They had a child coming who would grow up knowing stability instead of desperation. They had a future that belonged to them alone, shaped by their choices rather than their obligations. It wasn't the easy life the other mail-order brides had wanted. It wasn't comfortable or safe or simple, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. Calvin returned 2 days later with the supplies they'd ordered, using their remaining $50. As he unloaded, he paused to study James and Eleanor with open curiosity. "You two look different," he observed. "Lighter somehow." "We are," Eleanor confirmed. "Debts paid, future's ours. Makes everything feel lighter." Calvin nodded approvingly. "That's good, real good." He hefted another bag from the wagon. "Heard some news down in the valley that might interest you. Territory's looking to establish a school circuit in the mountain communities. They're seeking families willing to host a traveling teacher for a few months each year." James and Eleanor exchanged glances. With a baby coming, education would matter. "Tell them we're interested," Eleanor said. "When the time comes," Calvin grinned, "I will. You two are building something real up here. Territory needs more families like you." After he left, James and Eleanor stood on their porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. The mountain was still harsh, still demanding, still dangerous. But it was also beautiful. And it was home. Eleanor's hand found James's, her wooden ring catching the fading light. "We made it," she said softly. "Through winter, through outlaws, through debt and desperation and everything else. We actually made it." James squeezed her fingers gently. "We did. Together." And somewhere in Eleanor's womb, their child grew. The future they'd fought so hard to create becoming tangible reality. The mountain had tested them with everything it had. Weather, violence, isolation, financial ruin, physical danger. They'd survived it all, and now they were ready to build something that would last. Summer arrived slowly at altitude, the mountain reluctant to release winter's grip even as the valley below bloomed with warmth. James and Eleanor spent June preparing for the baby in the small ways available to them, reinforcing the cradle James had built, sewing tiny clothes from fabric Eleanor had hoarded since Massachusetts, stockpiling supplies against the possibility that travel might become impossible near Eleanor's due date. Eleanor was approaching 6 months along now, her pregnancy unmistakable, even through the loose dresses she wore for practical comfort. The nausea had finally eased, replaced by an appetite that surprised them both. She ate constantly, her body demanding fuel for the child growing inside her. James found himself watching her with a mixture of awe and terror. This woman who'd climbed mountains and killed outlaws and survived impossible odds was now doing something even more dangerous, creating new life in a place where childbirth killed women regularly. Sarah Colton visited in early June, making the 8-mile journey to check on Eleanor and offer the wisdom of someone who'd birthed 3 children herself. She was a weathered woman in her 50s, strong from years of mountain living, with kind eyes that missed nothing. She examined Eleanor with practiced efficiency, feeling the position of the baby, asking questions about symptoms and discomfort. Her expression grew concerned as she worked. "The baby's positioned wrong," Sarah said finally, her tone gentle but serious. "Breech, feet first instead of head first." Eleanor's face paled. "Can it be turned?" "Sometimes." Sarah showed her techniques for trying to manually rotate the baby from outside. "But if it doesn't turn before labor starts, you'll need a doctor. Breech births in remote locations." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Death, for Eleanor, for the baby, or both? How long do I have? Eleanor's voice stayed steady despite the fear James could see in her eyes. 2 months until your full term. Sarah's expression was sympathetic. We'll try turning techniques every week. Sometimes babies rotate on their own. But if we get close to your time and nothing's changed, you need to be near a doctor. The nearest doctor was in the valley town, 3 days hard travel under good conditions. Getting Eleanor down the mountain while heavily pregnant would be dangerous enough. Attempting it during active labor could be fatal. After Sarah left, James held Eleanor while she allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of tears. Then she pulled herself together with the same determination that had carried her through everything else. We try the turning techniques, she said, and we prepare for the possibility that I'll need to go down to the valley before my due date. James nodded, already calculating logistics. I can build a travois, something that would let me transport you safely even if you couldn't walk. That night, neither of them slept well. James lay awake listening to Eleanor breathe, his hand resting on the swell of her belly where their child moved with increasing vigor. This baby who might kill Eleanor just by being born wrong. The unfairness of it burned. They'd survived so much. Winter storms, outlaws, debt collectors, his near death from infection. And now biology itself was threatening to take away everything they'd built. But morning came anyway, indifferent to human fear. And James and Eleanor rose to face it the same way they faced everything else. Together. July brought heat that made the cabin almost comfortable for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. She was 6 months along, moving more slowly as the baby's weight shifted her balance, but still insisting on doing her share of the work. Sarah visited weekly, attempting the turning techniques with Eleanor's full cooperation despite the discomfort. But the baby remained stubbornly breech, apparently quite comfortable in its dangerous position. We need to start planning for the valley trip, Sarah said after the third failed attempt. You're getting close to the point where travel will be too risky. Eleanor looked to James, who'd been dreading this conversation. When should we go? Soon. Sarah's expression was grave. By early August at the latest. That gives you a month before your due date to be settled near the doctor. In case labor starts early, a month away from the mountain. A month in the valley town where neither of them knew anyone beyond Calvin Tucker. A month of uncertainty and waiting and hoping the baby would either turn or be born safely despite its position. James hated every aspect of the plan, but he hated the alternative. Eleanor dying in childbirth because they'd stayed too stubborn to accept help. Even more. We'll go mid-August, he decided. Gives us time to secure the cabin and animals, arrange care with neighbors, get Eleanor down safely. Sarah nodded approval. I'll send word to Doc Hendricks. He's good with difficult births. Probably your best chance. After she left, Eleanor stood at the window looking out at the mountains she'd come to love. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby move. I don't want to leave, she said quietly. This is home. James moved to stand beside her. It's temporary. We go down, have the baby safely, come back when you're strong enough. What if something goes wrong? What if I die down there and you're stuck in some strange town with an infant and you're not going to die? James pulled her close, feeling her tension. Doc Hendricks is good. Sarah says he's delivered hundreds of babies. You're strong. We're going to get through this. Eleanor leaned into him, accepting the comfort even though they both knew he couldn't promise what he was promising. Childbirth was Russian roulette on the frontier, especially with complications. But what else could they do except hope? August arrived with weather that turned unpredictable. Hot one day, cold the next, rain alternating with brilliant sunshine. Eleanor was 7 months along, moving with increasing difficulty, her ankles swelling despite Sarah's advice to rest with her feet elevated. James had built a sturdy travois that could be pulled by patients, with padding and covers to protect Eleanor during the journey. He'd stockpiled supplies for the trip and arranged for Sarah's son to check on their cabin and animals weekly. Everything was ready for their departure on August 15th. Then, on August 12th, Eleanor woke James in the middle of the night. Something's wrong. Her voice was tight with pain, her hand pressed to her belly where contractions were already visible. James felt ice flood his veins as he lit a lamp and saw the fear on her face. It's too early. Eleanor's breathing was rapid, panicked. I'm barely 29 weeks. The baby can't come now. But her body disagreed. Another contraction hit, strong enough to make Eleanor cry out. James had seen enough animal births to recognize what this meant. Labor had started. 2 months early, with the baby still breech, 3 days from the nearest doctor. James made decisions with the same focused clarity that had kept him alive through 4 years of mountain survival. He got Eleanor into warm clothes, secured the travois to patients, and loaded every supply they might need. Then he went to wake Sarah. They'd need her expertise for the journey. Within an hour, they were moving. Eleanor lay on the travois, wrapped in blankets, her face pale and tight with pain. Sarah rode patience while James walked alongside, one hand always on Eleanor, monitoring her condition. The descent began in darkness, James navigating by moonlight and memory. Every jolt of the travois made Eleanor gasp. Every contraction made her grip the sides until her knuckles went white. Sarah checked her regularly, her expression growing increasingly concerned. Labor's progressing fast, too fast. If we don't get to the doctor soon? How long do we have? James asked. Hours, maybe less. Sarah's voice dropped. James, if we have to deliver on the trail with the baby breech. She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. They would both die. Eleanor and the baby, bleeding out on some mountain trail while James watched helplessly. That wasn't acceptable. James picked up the pace, pushing harder than was safe on steep terrain. Patience struggled with the weight and angle, several times nearly losing her footing. But they kept moving downward, racing against Eleanor's labor and the clock. Dawn broke over them halfway through the first day. Eleanor was barely conscious, exhaustion and pain taking their toll. Between contractions, she drifted into a state that worried James more than her earlier fear. Eleanor, stay with me. He gripped her hand, willing her to hold on. We're going to make it. Just keep fighting. Her eyes opened, unfocused. Tired, James. So tired. I know. But you can't give up. Our baby needs you. I need you. Another contraction hit, and Eleanor screamed. Sarah checked her progress and swore under her breath. She's fully dilated. The baby's coming whether we're ready or not. They were still a day from the valley. Too far. James felt desperation clawing at him, the same helpless rage he'd felt watching Thomas Farrell die. But he was not that same man anymore. He'd learned from Eleanor that sometimes survival meant accepting help, adapting plans, doing whatever it took. There's a mining camp 6 miles east, James said suddenly. Abandoned now, but it has a cabin, shelter. Can she make it 6 miles? She has to. James redirected their path, cutting cross-country toward the mining camp he'd scouted years ago. The terrain was rougher, but the distance was shorter than continuing to the valley. Eleanor drifted in and out of awareness during those 6 miles. James walked beside her, talking constantly, reminding her of everything they'd survived together, promising her the future they'd planned. You're going to hold our baby, he told her. You're going to teach them everything you know. You're going to grow old with me on that mountain, watching our grandchildren play. Eleanor's hand found his, grip weak but present. Promise? I promise. Just hold on. The mining camp appeared like salvation, 3 rough cabins and a storage building, all abandoned but still weather-tight. James got Eleanor inside the largest cabin, Sarah immediately working to create a clean birthing area with the limited supplies they had. James built a fire, boiled water, prepared everything Sarah requested. But underneath the activity, terror churned. This was happening in the worst possible conditions. Too early, baby positioned wrong, no doctor, no proper medical supplies. Eleanor could die here. Their baby could die while here. Both could die, and James would be left with nothing except another grave to carry. Sarah called him over. James, I need you to listen carefully. This baby is breech, and Eleanor's losing a lot of blood. I'm going to try to turn it during the next contraction, but if I can't, we'll have to deliver feet first. What are the chances? James made himself ask. Sarah's expression told him everything. Not good. Even if the baby survives the delivery, being this early, she stopped. You should prepare yourself. For what? Eleanor losing the baby? Eleanor dying? Both? The next contraction hit before James could process further. Sarah positioned herself, hands working with practiced expertise, as she attempted to manually rotate the baby into proper position. Eleanor screamed, a sound of agony so profound that James felt it in his bones. He held her hand, whispering encouragement, while Sarah worked with focused intensity. "Got it," Sarah's voice carried fierce triumph. "Baby's turned. We can deliver properly now." But Eleanor was barely conscious, blood loss and exhaustion taking their toll. Sarah's expression shifted from triumph to concern. "She's too weak to push effectively. We're going to need help. Tell me what to do," James said immediately. Sarah showed him how to support Eleanor's body, how to apply pressure that would help expel the baby when contractions came. It was intimate and terrifying and nothing James had ever imagined doing. But Eleanor needed him, so he did it. Labor continued through the afternoon. Eleanor rallied between contractions, her strength surfacing in moments of lucidity where she pushed with everything she had left. James supported her physically and emotionally, refusing to let her give up even when she begged for it to be over. The baby crowned as sunset approached. Sarah worked with quick efficiency, guiding the infant's head, shoulders, body through the birth canal. And then suddenly there was a new sound in the cabin. A baby crying. Sarah held up a tiny, wrinkled infant girl, undersized from the premature birth but alive and screaming with impressive volume. "She's breathing. Good color. She's got a chance." James felt tears streaming down his face as Sarah cleaned the baby and wrapped her in cloths they'd boiled for sterility. His daughter. His and Eleanor's daughter, alive despite everything. But Eleanor, she lay pale and still, breathing but unconscious, blood soaking the blankets beneath her. Too much blood. Sarah worked frantically to stop the hemorrhaging, packing herbs and applying pressure, doing everything frontier medicine allowed. James held his newborn daughter with one hand while gripping Eleanor's hand with the other. "Don't you leave me. You promised me a future. You have to be here for it." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Baby, she's perfect." James brought the infant closer so Eleanor could see. "She's fighting just like her mother." Eleanor's smile was weak but genuine. "Good." Then she passed out again. Sarah worked through the night to stabilize Eleanor. The bleeding eventually slowed, but Eleanor remained unconscious, her body depleted beyond what it could easily recover from. James sat between his wife and his daughter, keeping vigil over both, while Sarah caught a few hours of sleep. The baby, they hadn't even named her yet, nursed weakly when James coaxed her to Eleanor's breast, her tiny mouth working instinctively even though Eleanor couldn't consciously help. This was parenthood on the frontier, not the gentle scene of a mother cradling her infant in safety, but a desperate fight for survival measured in heartbeats and breaths. Dawn came. Eleanor still hadn't woken. James checked her pulse, weak but steady, breathing, shallow but consistent. She was alive. That had to be enough for now. The baby woke crying, hungry again. James had no idea how to feed an infant whose mother couldn't nurse, but Sarah stirred at the sound and showed him how to dip cloth in water, mixed with a tiny amount of sugar, giving the baby something to suck on until Eleanor could feed her properly. "We need to get to the valley," Sarah said. "Eleanor needs a real doctor. Medicine we don't have here. Can she travel? Not safely, but staying here might kill her anyway." Sarah's expression was grim. Infection risk is high without proper supplies, so they had to move again. James prepared the travois, this time with Eleanor and the baby both needing transport. The journey to the valley would take at least 2 more days in their current condition. 2 days that Eleanor might not have. But giving up wasn't an option. They traveled slowly, stopping frequently to check Eleanor's condition and feed the baby. James walked in a state of exhausted focus. His world narrowed to 3 things: keeping Eleanor alive, keeping the baby alive, moving forward. Sarah handled most of the medical care, her experience invaluable. But even she looked worried by the end of the first day. "She's developing fever, infections setting in." James felt his heart clench. "What do we do?" "Get to the doctor faster." Sarah's voice was gentle but honest. "Push through tonight. We can make the valley by tomorrow afternoon if we don't stop." No sleep, no rest. Just relentless forward movement while Eleanor burned with fever and the baby cried weakly from hunger. James had never been so tired or so terrified in his life. The second night was hell. Eleanor's fever spiked high enough that she became delirious, mumbling words that made no sense, sometimes crying out in pain. The baby refused to nurse properly, her tiny body struggling with being born too soon. James walked through darkness lit only by the moon, every step an act of will. His legs burned, his back screamed from the unnatural position of supporting the travois. His eyes struggled to focus, but Eleanor's labored breathing drove him forward. The baby's weak cries gave him purpose. He would get them to safety. He would not lose them. He would not. Sarah walked beside him, silent support. She'd been awake as long as James, working just as hard, but she never complained or suggested they stop. The mountain community took care of its own, and Eleanor had become one of them. Dawn of the second day revealed the valley spread before them. Buildings visible in the distance, smoke from chimneys, the signs of civilization that had never looked so beautiful. James found energy he didn't know he had left. The final miles passed in a blur of desperate motion, and then suddenly they were in the town, people staring at their bedraggled group, someone running to fetch the doctor. Doc Hendricks was a gray-haired man with steady hands and kind eyes. He took one look at Eleanor and immediately began issuing orders. Get her inside. Boil water. I need clean linens. James carried Eleanor into the doctor's office, turned surgery, laying her on the examination table while Hendricks worked with practiced efficiency. The baby was taken by a nurse who promised to find a wet nurse who could feed her properly. Then James was ushered out, told to wait while the doctor worked. He collapsed on a bench outside, every muscle shaking with exhaustion and reaction. Sarah sat beside him, her own face gray with fatigue. You got them here, she said quietly. That's all you could do. Now we wait. Waiting was agony. James sat outside that door for hours while the sun climbed and then began its descent. Other patients came and went. The nurse appeared periodically to report that the baby was feeding well from the wet nurse, gaining strength despite her premature birth. But no news about Eleanor. Finally, as evening approached, Doc Hendricks emerged. His face was grave but not hopeless. She's alive. Hendricks sat heavily beside James. The infection was bad, but I've seen worse. I cleaned the wounds, administered medicine we have for blood poisoning. She's got a fighting chance. When can I see her? Now, but be prepared. She's very weak. Recovery will take time. James entered the small room where Eleanor lay. She was pale as death, so still she might have been a corpse, except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Bandages covered her abdomen, and the sharp smell of carbolic acid hung in the air. He pulled a chair to her bedside and took her hand gently. The skin was hot with fever, but her pulse was stronger than it had been on the trail. I got you here, he told her unconscious form. You and the baby both. Now you have to fight. You have to come back to us. Eleanor's fingers twitched in his grip, the barest acknowledgement of his presence. James sat with her through the night, refusing to leave even when the nurse suggested he get rest. He'd slept on the mountain for 4 years, slept through blizzards and attacks and every manner of hardship. He could stay awake to watch over his wife. Eleanor's fever broke on the 3rd day. James was dozing in his chair when her voice, weak but clear, cut through his exhausted haze. James, he jolted awake to find her eyes open, focused on him with recognition. Eleanor, thank God. The baby? Alive, strong, feeding well from a wet nurse. James felt tears he'd been holding back for days finally fall. You did it. You gave us a daughter. Eleanor's smile was fragile but genuine. We did it, together. Over the following week, Eleanor slowly regained strength. Doc Hendricks pronounced her out of immediate danger, though he warned that full recovery would take months. The internal damage from the difficult birth was significant, and he was blunt about the risks of future pregnancies. Another child could kill you, he told Eleanor plainly. Your body's been through tremendous trauma. If you conceive again, the chances of surviving childbirth are poor. Eleanor absorbed this with the same pragmatic acceptance she brought to everything else. One child is enough. One miracle. James met her eyes and saw peace there despite the loss of the future they'd imagined. Several children, a house full of life and noise. One child would have to be enough. And when the nurse brought their daughter for Eleanor to hold properly for the first time, James understood that one child was more than enough. She was perfect. Tiny and wrinkled and underweight, but perfect. Dark eyes like her mother, wispy dark hair, and a determined cry that suggested she'd inherited Eleanor's stubborn will to survive. "We need to name her," Eleanor said, cradling the infant against her chest. James had been thinking about this since the birth. "Clara, after my mother. She would have loved you." Eleanor looked at the baby, testing the name silently. "Clara Hartley. I like it. Clara it is." They stayed in the valley town for 2 weeks while Eleanor recovered enough strength to travel. The townspeople were kind, taking up a collection to help with medical costs, offering supplies and support to the young family who'd nearly lost everything. James worked odd jobs to pay for their room and board, grateful for the community's generosity but eager to return to the mountain. This town was pleasant enough, but it wasn't home. Home was a cabin at altitude surrounded by pines and peaks where he and Eleanor had built something worth defending. The journey back took 5 days, moving slowly to accommodate Eleanor's limited strength. Clara rode in a sling against Eleanor's chest, nursing regularly now that Eleanor's milk had come in properly. The baby was gaining weight, growing stronger, transforming from a fragile, premature infant into something more robust. When their cabin finally came into view, Eleanor sighed with relief. Home. James helped her down from the travois, supporting her as she walked the last few yards to their door. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it. Sarah's son had maintained the property beautifully. The animals were healthy, the cabin clean and waiting. Eleanor moved through the space with visible pleasure, touching familiar objects, settling into the chair by the fire with Clara in her arms. The baby looked around with wide dark eyes, taking in her first view of the place that would shape her entire childhood. "This is where you'll grow up," Eleanor told her softly. "Where you'll learn to be strong and capable and honest. Where you'll understand that beautiful things are allowed to be difficult." James watched his wife and daughter from the doorway, feeling something profound settle in his chest. This moment, Eleanor nursing their baby in the cabin they'd defended and earned, autumn light streaming through windows James had built himself. This was what he'd been surviving toward without knowing it. Not just existence, but life. Real life, with all its mess and terror and unexpected joy. The first year of Clara's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. She grew from fragile preemie to sturdy infant, meeting every milestone despite her rough start. Eleanor regained her strength slowly, though Doc Hendricks had been right about lasting effects. She tired more easily than before, and certain physical tasks were now beyond her capability. But she adapted, as always. What she couldn't do herself, she taught James to do. They became even more of a partnership, dividing labor based on current ability rather than traditional gender roles. James learned to cook meals Eleanor would have once handled alone. Eleanor managed the financial planning and household organization that kept them stable. Together, they raised Clara, teaching her the mountain's lessons from her earliest moments. Other mountain families began visiting regularly, drawn by word that the Hartleys had survived against impossible odds. Young mail-order bride Anna, married to Sarah Colton's son, came often for Eleanor's advice about managing frontier life. Eleanor shared her wisdom freely. "Don't look for easy, look for honest. Everything worth having requires work to maintain." The traveling teacher arrived in September, staying with the Hartleys for 2 months as part of the new school circuit. She taught Clara her first letters despite the baby being barely a year old, and provided adult conversation that both James and Eleanor had missed during their isolation. Life developed rhythm and routine. Not easy, but sustainable. The kind of life Eleanor had sought when she answered James's advertisement. Partnership, purpose, honest hardship that came with genuine rewards. 1 year to the day after Clara's birth, James and Eleanor stood on their porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in brilliant color. Clara slept inside, healthy and strong, having survived her first full year of mountain life. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked. "Answering my advertisement? Coming here?" Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that childbirth nearly killed us both. I regret the debt that caused so much suffering. I regret the violence we had to commit to protect our home." She looked at him directly. "But I don't regret choosing you, choosing this life. Everything difficult that happened. It happened because we were building something real. That matters more than comfort or safety." James pulled her close, careful of the residual weakness in her body. We built something that'll outlast us. Clara will grow up knowing what partnership actually means, what strength actually requires. She'll grow up knowing her parents loved each other enough to survive hell together. Eleanor's voice was soft but certain. That's better than most children get. They stood together in the fading light, two people who'd found each other through circumstance and chosen to stay through intention. The mountain rose around them, harsh and beautiful, the same force that had tested them and forged them into something stronger than they'd been separately. 7 mail-order brides had come to James's mountain seeking something they couldn't find. Each had left within a week, unable to reconcile fantasy with reality. But Eleanor Morrison had come seeking exactly what James had to offer: honest partnership in the face of honest hardship. She'd stayed through blizzards and violence, debt and desperation, nearly dying to give them a future worth living. And in staying, she'd given James something he'd stopped believing he deserved: a second chance, a real family, a love built on truth rather than illusion. Inside the cabin, Clara stirred and began to cry. Eleanor moved to go to her, but James stopped her with a gentle hand. "I'll get her, you rest." Eleanor smiled and settled back into her chair, watching through the window as James disappeared inside. A moment later, his voice carried through the open door, low and soothing as he comforted their daughter. This was the life they'd built. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. Eleanor looked out at the mountains she'd learned to call home, at the wilderness that had demanded everything from her and somehow given back even more. She thought about Thomas, her first husband, who'd chosen surrender when life got hard. Thought about the 14 years she'd spent in factories, invisible and grinding away. Thought about the woman who'd stepped off Calvin Tucker's wagon 13 months ago, carrying nothing but determination and realistic expectations. That woman had been strong, but this woman, wife, mother, mountain survivor, was stronger. The best foundations are built on truth, not comfort, Eleanor thought, repeating the wisdom she'd tried to share with Anna and would someday share with Clara. We built ours on honesty in winter. It'll outlast anything. James emerged from the cabin with Clara in his arms, the baby already settling from her brief upset. He sat beside Eleanor on the porch, their daughter between them, and the three of them watched the last light fade from the peaks. "I love you," James said simply, "not for saving my life or giving me Clara, just for being exactly who you are." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "I love you too, for the same reason." It wasn't poetry, it wasn't romance from penny novels or the passionate declarations other couples made, but it was true. And truth, Eleanor had learned, was worth more than any amount of beautiful lies. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow from higher elevations. Winter would come again soon. As it always did, they would face it together, as they always did, and they would survive. Because that's what they'd built. Not just a marriage or a home, but a partnership strong enough to weather anything the mountain or life could throw at them. 7 women had run from this life, 1 woman had run toward it, and that made all the difference.